Hello guys, welcome to Fiction Blue. Today we have an incredible story for you. What if Harry used ancient runes to put a security system on the cupboard that punished anyone who approached? If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, Nail and Plaster. The nail was 3 inches long and rusted the color of old blood. Harry found it in the back corner of his cupboard, where the baseboard had pulled away from the wall and left a gap wide enough to lose things in. He'd been reaching into that gap because he'd dropped his only pencil, the stub of one, really, barely 2 inches long, swiped from the bin in Dudley's second bedroom where perfectly good things went to die under mountains of broken toys. His fingers had closed around the nail instead, and he'd pulled it out and held it up in the thin line of light that crept under the cupboard door. It was just a nail. But it felt good in his hand. Solid. Real. Like it belonged there. Harry was 7 years old, and he had very few things that belonged to him. The pencil. A wool blanket that smelled like dust. 3 plastic soldiers with the paint rubbed off that Dudley had thrown at his head and forgotten about. The clothes on his back, which were Dudley's clothes, which meant they fit Harry the way a tent fits a broomstick. And now a nail. He set it on the little shelf above his mattress, the shelf he'd made himself by wedging a piece of cardboard between the wall studs, and went back to looking for the pencil. He found it. He also found a dead spider, a penny, and a button. He kept all of them. You didn't throw things away when you lived in a cupboard under the stairs. Everything was potentially useful. Outside, he could hear Aunt Petunia in the kitchen, the particular aggressive clatter that meant she was angry about something and taking it out on the dishes. Uncle Vernon was in the sitting room. The television was on, the news, by the sound of it, Vernon's evening ritual of watching the world and finding it insufficiently ordered. Dudley was upstairs, the ceiling above Harry's head creaking with every heavy footstep, probably jumping on his bed again or swinging that new cricket bat at the furniture. Normal evening. Normal house. Normal family, minus one abnormal boy in a cupboard. Harry pulled his blanket up to his chin and listened to the house breathe. That was something he'd started doing lately, listening. Not just to voices and footsteps and the television, but to the house itself. The way the pipes hummed in the walls. The way the wood settled and clicked when the temperature dropped at night. The way the air moved differently depending on which doors were open. When you spent a lot of time in a very small space, you got to know things. The cupboard was Harry's whole world after dark, and he knew every inch of it. The water stain on the ceiling that looked like a running horse. The crack in the plaster above the door that grew a little wider every winter. The way the third stair from the bottom creaked exactly at 9:15 every night when Vernon went up to bed, and the slightly different creak it made at 6:30 every morning when he came back down. Harry knew this cupboard the way a sailor knows his ship. Every sound, every smell, every texture in the dark. Which is why, when something changed, he noticed. It happened on a Thursday. Thursdays were bad days because Thursday was bins day, which meant Harry had to drag the bins to the curb before school, and if he didn't do it fast enough Vernon would clip him round the ear and call him a lazy waste of space. This particular Thursday was worse than usual because it had rained during the night and the bin bags had split and there was rubbish all over the front garden and Vernon acted like Harry had personally orchestrated this to embarrass him in front of the neighbors. "You did this," Vernon said, his face doing that thing where it went from pink to red to a peculiar shade of purple that made him look like an enormous overripe plum. "I don't know how, but you did this. Some sort of funny business." Harry had learned that there was no correct response to this accusation. Saying, "No I didn't," made Vernon angrier. Saying nothing made Vernon angrier. Apologizing made Vernon angrier. Everything made Vernon angrier, because Vernon's anger had nothing to do with Harry's actions and everything to do with Vernon's need to be angry at something, and Harry was the designated something. So Harry just stood there in the rain, in his oversized trainers and Dudley's old raincoat that hung past his knees, and waited for it to be over. It was not over quickly. The ear clipping graduated to a hard shove that sent Harry stumbling into the bins, which knocked one over, which sent more rubbish across the garden, which made Vernon even more furious. By the time Harry had cleaned everything up, rebagged the rubbish, dragged the bins to the curb, and come back inside, he was soaked through and shivering and 15 minutes late for school. "You're not going to school like that," Petunia said, looking at him like he was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "You'll drip everywhere. Get in your cupboard and stay there." "But, cupboard. Now." Harry went to his cupboard. Petunia locked the door behind him. The bolt slid home with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He sat on his mattress in the dark, wet and cold and shaking, and not entirely from the cold. There was something else. Something hot and tight in his chest that he'd been pushing down for years, pushing down so hard and so constantly that he'd almost forgotten it was there. But today it was closer to the surface than usual. Today it had teeth. Harry pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes and breathed. In and out. In and out. The way he'd taught himself when things got bad. Focus on the breathing. Focus on the dark. The dark was safe. The dark was his. The hot thing in his chest pulsed. And the house groaned. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a low, structural sound, like a big animal shifting in its sleep. The pipes in the wall behind Harry's head hummed a note he'd never heard before, lower and longer, almost a vibration more than a sound. The light bulb above his head, the bare one with the pull string that hadn't worked in months, flickered once. Then everything was still. Harry opened his eyes. His heart was hammering. He could feel it in his fingertips, his temples, the soles of his feet. He could feel something else too, a warmth in the wall behind him, like the plaster was blushing. He pressed his palm flat against it and the warmth pushed back, gentle as a breath. The hot thing in his chest settled. Not gone. But settled. Like a dog that had been circling and finally lay down. Harry sat very still for a long time. Then he reached for the nail. He didn't know why. There was no thought process, no decision tree, no moment of, I should do this because. He just reached for it the way you reach for a glass of water when you're thirsty, because your body knows what it needs before your mind catches up. The nail was cool and solid in his fingers. He turned it point down and pressed it against the wall beside his mattress, just above the baseboard, and he began to scratch. Not words. Not pictures. Not anything he'd seen before or could name. Just shapes. Lines that curved and crossed and doubled back on themselves. A vertical stroke. A diagonal. A fork. A diamond. Something that looked like a zigzag with a tail. Something that looked like a tree struck by lightning. He scratched them into the plaster slowly, carefully, the nail biting through the paint and into the chalky white beneath. The sound was small and precise, scritch, 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 like a mouse working at something in the walls. It felt right. It felt like spelling a word he'd always known but never spoken aloud. Each mark connected to the last, and the connections had a logic to them, a grammar, even though Harry couldn't have explained it any more than he could have explained why English sentences needed verbs. They just did. That's how it worked. That's how this worked. He scratched for what felt like hours. The shape spread across the wall beside his mattress, 18 inches wide, maybe 12 inches tall. Not random. Not neat either, but purposeful. A system. When he finally pulled the nail away, his fingers were cramped and there was plaster dust on his blanket and a fine white grit under his fingernails. The wall was warm. Not hot. Not the kind of warm that meant something was wrong, not pipes or wiring or the heating gone funny. A different kind of warm. A living kind. Like the plaster was breathing. Harry pressed his palm against the scratched symbols and felt that warmth push into his hand and up his arm and settle somewhere behind his breastbone, right where the hot tight thing lived, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, something inside him unclenched. He fell asleep like that, his hand on the wall, his cheek on the mattress, the shapes glowing faintly in the dark, though Harry was already asleep and didn't see. The glow was pale gold. It lasted almost until morning. Vernon unlocked the cupboard at 6:30 the next morning, same as always. He yanked the door open, same as always, and leaned in with that particular expression, jaw set, eyes narrow, nostrils flared. That was his version of a wake-up call. He opened his mouth to bark whatever command he had queued up: get up, make breakfast, mow the lawn, exist less, and then something happened that had never happened before. He flinched. It was subtle. A twitch in his shoulders, a half-step backward, a flicker of something behind his eyes that looked almost like, but couldn't be, because Vernon Dudley did not feel, uncertainty. He blinked twice, rapidly, like a man who'd been staring at the sun and was seeing spots. "Get up," he said. His voice was slightly less loud than usual. "Breakfast won't make itself." He turned and walked away. Didn't clip Harry's ear. Didn't grab his shoulder. Didn't even do that thing where he leaned in too close and made sure Harry could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Harry, who had been awake for 20 minutes and had been lying very still with his hand on the warm wall, watched Vernon go. He looked at the marks he'd scratched into the plaster. In the grey morning light, they looked like nothing. Random scratches. The kind of damage a bored child might do to a wall. But they weren't nothing. Harry knew that the way he knew his own name. He got up. He made breakfast. He did the washing up. He went to school. The day was normal. Vernon was normal at dinner, loud, dismissive, mean in the casual way that was just the weather of the house. Everything was the same. Except. When Vernon passed the cupboard door on his way to the sitting room after dinner, he walked a little wider than usual. Gave it a few extra inches. Probably didn't even know he was doing it. Harry noticed. Harry always noticed. That night, back in his cupboard, he picked up the nail and went back to work. The second night's scratching was different. The first set of marks had been instinct, pure, unfiltered, like coughing or sneezing. The symbols had come from somewhere below thought, below intention, from whatever place inside Harry produced the strange things that the Dursleys refused to name. The second night, Harry was paying attention. He sat cross-legged on his mattress, the nail balanced across his palm, and he looked at what he'd done the night before. Really looked. Not at the shapes themselves but at the spaces between them. The way they related to each other. The way certain lines pointed towards certain other lines, and the way the curves created channels, like rivers on a map, that flowed in a specific direction. The direction was outward. From the wall, through the plaster, toward the cupboard door. Toward the place where people came in. Harry turned the nail in his fingers and thought about that. Then he started scratching again, but this time he started on the wall opposite, the one his feet pointed toward when he lay down. He worked slowly, feeling his way, letting the nail find its own path but watching where it went. Vertical line. Horizontal cross. A shape like an hourglass. A shape like a mouth. A circle that wasn't quite closed, with a tail that spiraled inward. When he finished this section, he sat back and looked at both walls. Left wall, the first set of marks, pointing outward. Right wall, the new set, pointing. Harry cocked his head, inward. Toward him. Like the first set was a shield and the second set was a net, and he was sitting in the space between them. The warmth was there again. Stronger now, coming from both walls, meeting in the middle where Harry sat. Not hot. Not uncomfortable. The temperature of a sun-warmed blanket. The temperature of being held. Harry touched the new marks and felt something he could only describe as recognition. Like the wall knew him. Like the shapes knew him. Like he'd written his name in a language older than English and the house had read it and understood. He was smiling when he fell asleep. He didn't smile very often. It felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten he had. The next day was Saturday, which was bad because Saturday meant a full day with the Dursleys instead of the merciful interruption of school. Harry's Saturday routine was, wake up, make breakfast, clean kitchen, do laundry, weed garden, clean bathrooms, make lunch, wash car, make dinner, clean kitchen again, cupboard. It was a routine designed to extract maximum labor while maintaining minimum visibility. Harry was supposed to be a ghost that did chores. Present enough to be useful, invisible enough to be forgotten. He didn't mind the work itself. The work was just work. What he minded was Dudley. Dudley was 8 and already the size of a small refrigerator. He had his father's build and his father's temperament and his mother's talent for pretending that his worst impulses were charming eccentricities. Dudley's so spirited, Petunia would say, when what she meant was, Dudley just pushed a smaller child into a ditch. Boys will be boys, Vernon would chuckle, when what he meant was, my son is a bully and I'm proud of it. Dudley's favorite Saturday activity was Harry hunting. The rules were simple, Dudley and his friends chased Harry, and if they caught him, they hit him. There was no winning condition for Harry except not getting caught. Today Dudley had Piers Polkiss with him, a ratty-faced boy who was to Dudley what a remora is to a shark, smaller, faster, and useful for getting into the spaces the bigger predator couldn't reach. They found Harry in the back garden around noon, weeding the flower beds. Oi, Dudley said. What are you doing? Harry didn't look up. Weeding. Looks boring. It is. You're boring. Okay. Dudley kicked dirt onto the section Harry had just weeded. Piers giggled. Harry looked at the scattered dirt and then went back to weeding, pulling the same weeds again without comment. This infuriated Dudley, because the entire point of the exercise was to get a reaction, and Harry had gotten very good at not giving one. Dudley kicked more dirt. Harry kept weeding. Dudley stepped on Harry's hand. Harry pulled it free and switched to the other hand. Dudley's face was starting to do the Vernon thing, pink, red, purple, in a predictable gradient of frustration. Look at me when I'm talking to you, Dudley said. Harry looked at him. Green eyes, flat and calm, behind glasses that were held together with tape. There was nothing in those eyes that Dudley could grab onto. No fear, no anger, no tears. Just a steady, patient observation, like Harry was watching weather. You're so weird, Dudley said. He looked at Piers for support. So weird, Piers confirmed. Dudley shoved Harry. Not hard, by Dudley standards, a casual, contemptuous push that sent Harry from his knees onto his back in the dirt. Harry lay there for a moment, looking at the sky. It was the pale grey of an English spring. Somewhere, a bird was singing. Get up, Dudley said. Harry got up. My dad says you should be grateful we let you live here, Dudley said. He'd heard Vernon say this and was trying it on for size, the way children do with their parents' cruelties. Says you'd be in an orphanage otherwise. Says your parents were drunks who got themselves killed in a car crash. Harry said nothing. But something moved behind his eyes, a flicker, quick and hot, like a match struck in a dark room. He turned back to the flower bed and picked up the trowel and went back to weeding. Dudley, emboldened by the silence, aimed a kick at Harry's back. It didn't connect. Dudley's foot swung forward and then, just, stopped. Not like hitting a wall. More like moving through water that got thicker and thicker until motion became impossible. His shoe hung in the air, 6 inches from Harry's spine, and Dudley overbalanced and sat down hard on the grass with a yelp. What was, Dudley's face was white. He scrambled backward on his hands and heels like a crab. What did you do? Harry turned around. He looked at Dudley on the ground. He looked at his own hands, which were dirty from weeding and perfectly still. He hadn't done anything. Not consciously. Not deliberately. The match flicker behind his eyes settled into something quieter and more considered. I didn't do anything, Harry said. You tripped. I didn't trip. Something, Piers, you saw something, but Piers had seen nothing. He'd been picking his nose and had looked up to find Dudley on the ground, which was funny enough that he forgot to be a proper henchman about it and snorted a laugh before catching himself. Dudley scrambled to his feet and ran inside, bellowing for his mother. Harry watched him go, then looked down at his hands again. They were tingling. Not painfully. The way your foot tingles when it's been asleep and the blood is coming back. He went back to weeding. That evening, Vernon stormed to the cupboard and threw the door open. "What did you do to my son?" Harry was sitting on his mattress, reading a school textbook by the light of the bare bulb that still didn't work, except that now, somehow, it did. A dim, warm glow, just enough to read by. Vernon didn't seem to notice. "I didn't do anything, Uncle Vernon." He says something knocked him over. Some sort of, Vernon couldn't say the word. He could never say the word. The word was magic and it was banned in this house the way oxygen is banned in a vacuum, by fundamental law. Some sort of nonsense, he finished, his mustache bristling. "He tripped," Harry said. "On the grass. It was wet." Vernon stared at him. Harry stared back. The light bulb hummed softly. The walls of the cupboard were warm. Vernon became aware, very slowly, that he did not want to be standing in this doorway. He could not have said why. There was nothing threatening about a 7-year-old boy on a thin mattress in a cupboard under the stairs. There was nothing to be afraid of. Vernon Dursley was not afraid of a child. He was not afraid of anything, and especially not afraid of freakish nonsense, which did not exist. But his body was doing things his mind hadn't authorized. His shoulders had crept up toward his ears. His grip on the door frame had tightened until his knuckles were white. There was a pressure in the air, not physical, not really, but present, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the sky goes green and the birds stop singing and every animal instinct says get inside, get low, take cover. Vernon took a step back. Then another. Then he shut the cupboard door, not slammed, shut, carefully, the way you'd close a door you weren't sure about anymore, and walked away. Harry sat in his cupboard and listened to Vernon's footsteps retreat down the hall. He looked at the marks on the walls. Both sets were glowing faintly, so faintly you'd miss it if you weren't looking, a pale gold luminescence that lived in the scratched lines like veins carrying light instead of blood. "Ha," Harry said quietly. He picked up the nail. The library was Harry's church. He'd discovered the little whinging public library at age 6, when his class had taken a field trip and he'd realized, with a shock that rearranged his entire internal landscape, that this was a building full of books that anyone could borrow for free. The concept was so staggering that he'd stood in the children's section with his mouth open for a full minute while his classmates milled around him pulling picture books off shelves. Since then, he'd been back every week. Sometimes twice a week, when he could manage it. He read everything. Fiction, non-fiction, didn't matter. He read about dinosaurs and volcanoes and ancient Egypt and the solar system and how engines work and why the sky is blue. He read The Hobbit and the Chronicles of Narnia and A Wrinkle in Time. He read a book about codes and ciphers that he checked out 3 times. He read an encyclopedia of world mythology that was so heavy he had to sit on the floor to hold it. The Monday after the incident with Dudley, Harry went to the library after school and headed for a section he'd never paid much attention to before, ancient languages. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew that the shapes he was scratching into his cupboard walls meant something, and that meaning had a source, and sources could be found. Harry was 7 and he already understood, in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with formal education, that knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you. The ancient languages section in the little whinging library was not extensive. A shelf and a half. Some books about Latin, a couple about Greek, one about Egyptian hieroglyphics that was mostly pictures. And at the end, spine cracked and cover faded, a book called The Runes of the North, an introduction to Elder Futhark. Harry pulled it out and opened it and the floor dropped out from under him. The shapes. His shapes. Not identical, the ones in the book were cleaner, more standardized, drawn with a scholar's precision rather than a child's desperate nail, but unmistakably the same family. The same language. He sank to the floor and read. The Elder Futhark was the oldest form of Runic alphabet, used by Germanic and Norse peoples from roughly the 2nd to the 8th century. 24 characters, each representing both a sound and a concept. Fehu, wealth, cattle, abundance. Uras, strength, the aurochs, untamed power. Thurisaz, thorn, giant, defensive force. Ensaz, God, mouth, divine breath. Raidho, journey, will, movement. Kenas, torch, knowledge, illumination. Harry read the descriptions and felt recognition light up in his brain like a switchboard. Thurisaz, that was the one he'd scratched first, the shape like a thorn. The defensive one. The one that had made Vernon flinch. Kenas, that was the light. That was why his bulb worked now. Algiz, protection, the elk, the outstretched hand. He'd scratched that one above the door frame without knowing its name, and it was why Vernon couldn't stand in the doorway without wanting to leave. He'd been writing in runes. Real runes. An actual alphabet that actual people had used thousands of years ago. And somehow, when Harry wrote them, they worked. He checked the book out and took it home and hid it under his mattress and read it by the light of his impossible bulb until he could recite every rune from memory. The book told him what each symbol meant. It told him the history, the cultural context, the linguistic evolution. What it did not tell him, could not tell him, because the author was a university professor who studied dead languages and not a 7-year-old boy who could make plaster glow, was why they worked. But Harry was starting to figure that out on his own. The next 3 weeks were the most productive of Harry's life. He worked at night, after the house went quiet. The nail was his tool. The walls were his canvas. The rune book was his dictionary, but the grammar, the way the runes connected, the way they flowed into each other, the way combinations created effects greater than the sum of their parts, that came from somewhere inside Harry that the book couldn't reach. He started with the walls and moved to the ceiling. Thurisaz at every corner, defense, deflection, keep out. Algiz above the door, protection, sanctuary, this space is mine. Kenas around the light bulb, illumination, warmth, let there be light. Isa along the floor, stillness, ice, nothing gets through. But it was the combinations that really sang. Thurisaz linked to Algiz by a flowing line that Harry drew without thinking, and suddenly the defense wasn't just a push, it was a warning. Approach with bad intent and you'd feel uneasy at 3 feet, nauseous at 2, and at 1 foot you'd be hit with a wave of vertigo so intense you'd need to sit down. Harry tested this by calling Dudley to the cupboard door and asking him if he wanted a chocolate bar he'd found. Dudley made it to within 2 feet, turned gray, and vomited into the umbrella stand. Petunia blamed it on something he'd eaten. Dudley didn't go near the cupboard again. Kenas linked to Ansuz, knowledge to divine breath, torch to voice, and the light in the cupboard became responsive. It brightened when Harry was reading and dimmed when he was sleeping. It went out entirely when anyone else opened the door, as if it had never worked at all. Raidho linked to Isa, journey to stillness, movement to ice, and the cupboard's temperature stabilized. It had always been cold in winter and stuffy in summer, because it was a cupboard under the stairs with no ventilation and no insulation and no one who cared. Now it was cool when Harry was hot and warm when Harry was cold, and the air always smelled faintly of something clean, like rain on stone. Each night, he added more. Each day, he went to the library and read more. Not just the rune book now, he'd read that cover to cover 4 times, but everything adjacent to it. Norse mythology. Viking history. Icelandic sagas. A surprisingly detailed book about Scandinavian folk magic that described people carving runes into objects for protection and luck and healing. Those people had carved runes into wood and bone and stone. They'd believed the runes had power. The book treated this as quaint superstition, the kind of thing educated modern people smiled about. Harry, sitting in his glowing cupboard, surrounded by warm walls covered in working runes, did not smile about it. He was learning two things simultaneously. First, the runes worked because he made them work. The book was right that ordinary people couldn't just scratch a few symbols and expect magic. Something in Harry, the same something that made the garden hose act funny and his hair grow back overnight and turned his teacher's wig blue, that something was the engine. The runes were the steering wheel. Second, the runes didn't just do what the Old Norse people thought they did. The old meanings were starting points, seeds of intention, but what grew from them depended on the person planting. When Harry scratched Thurisaz, he wasn't summoning a frost giant. He was expressing, in a language that his strange inner engine understood, the concept of boundary. And his engine took that concept and built it, the way a factory takes a blueprint and builds a machine. Harry didn't have the vocabulary yet to describe what he was doing. He didn't know the words ward, enchantment, runic array, or magical intent. He didn't know that what he'd instinctively recreated was a discipline so old that entire civilizations had risen and fallen during its heyday. He didn't know that the last known wardwright of his caliber had lived in the 9th century and had single-handedly made the fortress of Bambra impregnable for 200 years. What he knew was simpler and more important: he could make things. Real things. Things that worked. Things that kept him safe. And he was getting better. The crisis came on a Saturday evening, 4 weeks after the first nail scratch. Vernon had been building toward something all week. Harry could feel it the way you feel a storm, a change in pressure, a heaviness in the air, a particular quality of silence that wasn't peace but preparation. Vernon had been watching Harry. Not the usual dismissive glance to make sure the freak was doing his chores, but a focused, calculating attention that meant gears were turning in his head. Harry knew what the gears were grinding on. The cupboard. Vernon hadn't opened it in weeks, hadn't been able to, really, though he hadn't tested it directly. But he'd noticed things. The way the light crept under the door sometimes. The way the air near the cupboard was different than the air in the rest of the house. The way Dudley gave it a wide berth. The way even Petunia, who walked past it 20 times a day, had started taking the long way around through the kitchen to get to the sitting room. Something was wrong with the cupboard, and Vernon was going to fix it, because Vernon Dudley was the man of this house and no cupboard, no boy, was going to be wrong in ways he didn't authorize. Harry was washing the dinner dishes when he felt it shift. A change in the house's breathing. Vernon's chair creaking in the sitting room. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it even though every soft animal part of his brain is screaming at him to reconsider. Harry dried his hands on the dish towel and turned around. Vernon was standing in the kitchen doorway. His face was the color of raw beef. His hands were at his sides, fists clenched. Behind him, in the hall, Harry could see the cupboard door. It looked perfectly ordinary. White paint, brass latch, utterly unremarkable. But the air around it shimmered, very slightly, like heat haze on a road in summer. Harry could see it. He didn't think Vernon could. "Right," Vernon said. "We're going to have a talk." "Okay," Harry said. "Don't you okay me." Vernon stepped into the kitchen. He was a big man, 6 feet, broad-shouldered, heavy in the way that spoke of too many pork pies and too few walks. He filled doorways. He was designed to fill doorways. It was his primary social function, being large enough to intimidate. "Something's going on in that cupboard." "I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me, boy." Vernon's mustache was doing the caterpillar thing, bristling and twitching with a life of its own. "I've heard noises. Scratching. And Petunia says the electric's gone funny near the stairs. Something's going on and I know it's your doing. You're sort of, he couldn't say it. The word stuck in his throat like a bone. "My sort of what?" Harry asked. He didn't ask it insolently. Didn't ask it with a sneer or a challenge. Asked it the way you'd ask someone to finish a sentence. But there was something underneath the question, a weight, a solidity, that hadn't been there a month ago. Harry was 7 years old and 4 feet tall and weighed about as much as one of Vernon's legs, and he asked the question without looking away. Vernon's face went a shade darker. "I'm going to open that cupboard," he said. "And whatever you've done in there, you're going to undo it. And if I find anything, freakish, so help me God, boy, you'll what?" The kitchen went quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on Privet Drive, its headlights sweeping across the window and away. Vernon stared at Harry. Harry stared at Vernon. It was, Harry realized, the first time he'd ever interrupted his uncle. The first time he'd ever pushed back. The word had come out of him as naturally as breathing, as naturally as the runes came out of the nail, and it sat in the air between them like a dropped glass that hadn't shattered yet. "What did you just say to me?" Vernon whispered. "I asked what you'll do," Harry said. His voice was steady. His hands weren't shaking. The hot tight thing in his chest was awake and present and paying attention, and for once he didn't push it down. "You'll what? Hit me? Lock me in for a week? Stop feeding me? You already do all of that, Uncle Vernon. So what's left?" Vernon moved fast for a big man. His hand shot out and grabbed Harry's arm and hauled him off his feet, and for a moment Harry was dangling, his toes brushing the tile floor, Vernon's grip bruising on his bicep, Vernon's face inches from his own. "You listen to me," Vernon hissed. "I took you in. I put a roof over your head. I feed you, I clothe you, and I expect gratitude, not this freakishness. Let go of me," Harry said. "I'll let go when I'm good and," the runes on the cupboard walls, 30 feet and 2 walls away, pulsed. Harry felt it in his bones. A surge, like a wave, starting in the cupboard and rolling outward through the house. Through the plaster, through the wood, through the wiring and the pipes, through every inch of structure until it reached the kitchen and washed over both of them. Vernon screamed. He didn't just flinch this time, didn't just feel queasy, didn't just get an urge to walk away. He screamed, a high, thin sound, shockingly un-Vernon, and dropped Harry and staggered backward into the kitchen counter, knocking over the dish rack with a crash of crockery. His hand, the one that had been holding Harry, was bright red, as if he'd grabbed a hot pipe. What, Harry landed on his feet. He looked at Vernon, who was cradling his hand and backing away, his eyes wild, his face white now instead of purple. He looked at his own arm, where Vernon's grip had left marks that were already darkening into bruises. The hot thing in his chest was roaring. "Don't touch me," Harry said. "Don't ever touch me again." He didn't shout. Didn't yell. Said it at conversational volume, the way you'd tell someone the time. And the house responded, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the floor and the walls and the window glass. The lights flickered. The dishes in the rack rattled. Petunia appeared in the doorway behind Vernon, clutching the frame, her eyes enormous. Vernon, what's happening?" the boy, Vernon gasped. His cupboard, something." Harry walked past them. Through the kitchen doorway, into the hall, to his cupboard. He opened the door, it opened easily for him, always easily for him, and stepped inside and sat down on his mattress. The runes on the walls were glowing openly now, no longer faintly, no longer subtly. Gold light filled the small space, warm and steady, and the cupboard that had been his prison was, suddenly, unmistakably, something else. A fortress. His fortress. 3 feet by 7 feet of absolute sovereignty. He pulled the door closed behind him. The latch clicked. And then the runes did something new, the symbols around the door frame connected, completed a circuit Harry hadn't consciously designed, and the door sealed. Not locked. Sealed. The way a vault seals. The way a sanctum seals. Nothing was getting through that door unless Harry wanted it to. On the other side, He could hear Vernon raging and Petunia crying and Dudley thumping down the stairs to see what the noise was about. He could hear Vernon trying the door handle and grunting with effort and then swearing and then trying again. He could hear Petunia saying, "Vernon, stop, Vernon, leave it, Vernon, don't," and Vernon not listening, because Vernon never listened when his authority was challenged. Harry heard Vernon kick the door. He heard the thud of it and then a louder thud as Vernon was thrown backward, literally, physically thrown, into the opposite wall. The house shuddered with the impact. Petunia screamed. Dudley started crying. Harry sat in his glowing cupboard and felt, for the first time in his life, completely safe. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, to no one. To the walls. To the runes. To whatever was inside him that made this possible. "I should have done this ages ago." The runes pulsed once, warm and gold. Harry picked up his rune book. He turned to the chapter he'd been studying, combinations, arrays, the way individual symbols could be linked into systems. He had so much to learn. The book was a starting point, a primer, a first-grade reader in a language that went deeper than he could yet imagine. But he had time. He had his cupboard. He had his nail. And he was not afraid. Things changed after that night. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The Dursleys were not the sort of people who had revelations. They were the sort of people who had adjustments, small, grudging recalibrations of behavior driven not by understanding but by self-preservation. Rats in a maze, learning which corridors shocked them. Vernon stopped touching Harry. Completely. No more ear clips, no more shoves, no more grabbing. He also stopped getting within 3 feet of Harry if he could help it, which, in a 3-bedroom semi-detached house, required some creative navigation. The kitchen was tense. Mealtimes were glacial. But Vernon's hand had blistered where he'd grabbed Harry's arm, actual blisters, the kind you got from touching a hot stove, and that had gotten through to him in a way that no amount of strange incidents ever had before. This wasn't vague, funny business he could rationalize away. This was cause and effect. Touch the boy, get burned. Simple. Clear. Even Vernon could do that math. Petunia was a different story. Harry caught her looking at the cupboard door one morning, 3 days after the incident, with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger or disgust or the tight-lipped disapproval that was her default setting. It was something older and more complicated. Something that involved memory. She saw Harry watching her and the expression vanished, replaced by the usual pursed-lip blankness. But Harry had seen it, and he filed it away in the meticulous mental archive he kept of everything that happened in this house. Petunia knew something. About the runes, or about what Harry was, or about some adjacent piece of the puzzle. She'd grown up with his mother, after all. His mother, who Vernon and Petunia never discussed. His mother, who died in a car crash that Harry had started to suspect, in the vague way he suspected many things, was not actually a car crash. But that was a question for later. Right now, Harry had work to do. The cupboard was secure. The cupboard was his. But the cupboard was small, and Harry's ambitions were growing. He started with the door frame. The runes he'd carved inside the cupboard were potent but limited in range, their effect dropped off sharply beyond the door. If Harry wanted protection that extended further, he needed to extend the network. The challenge was doing it without being seen. He solved this by working at night, after the Dursleys were asleep. He'd open the cupboard door, silently, the latch obeying his touch, and creep into the hallway with his nail and a small torch he'd taken from the kitchen junk drawer. He scratched runes into the baseboard along the hall. Tiny ones. Not the bold, broad strokes of the cupboard work but fine, precise characters no bigger than a thumbnail, hidden in the grain of the wood, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Kenas at the base of the staircase, awareness, illumination. Now Harry could feel when someone was on the stairs. Not hear, feel. A pressure in his mind, soft and specific, that told him not just that someone was there but who they were. Vernon's footsteps felt heavy and hot. Petunia's felt sharp and cold. Dudley's felt dull and round. Manna's beside the front door, self, humanity, intention. Now Harry could sense when someone approached the house from outside. The postman felt brisk and neutral. Mrs. Next Door felt curious and nosy. The man who read the electric meter felt bored and slightly dishonest. It was along the hallway skirting board, partnership, movement, trust. This one was experimental, and Harry wasn't sure what it would do until it did it. The house began to help him. Doors that Harry needed open would be unlocked. Floorboards that would normally creak under his feet went silent. The heating came on when Harry was cold and turned off when he wasn't, regardless of what the thermostat said. This last effect made Vernon furious, because the heating bill was suddenly unpredictable and Vernon was a man who valued predictability in all things. He called British Gas 3 times. A repairman came and found nothing wrong. Vernon raged. Petunia soothed. The heating continued to do exactly what Harry needed it to. The network grew. Night by night, rune by rune, the house at number 4, Privet Drive was becoming something other than what it appeared to be. From the outside, it looked the same as every other house on the street: brick, white trim, neat garden, sensible car in the drive. From the inside, it was slowly, quietly, unmistakably becoming Harry's. He was careful. He was patient. He was 7 years old and had learned, from years of living with people who wished he didn't exist, that patience was not weakness. Patience was planning. Patience was laying groundwork. Patience was scratching tiny symbols into baseboards at 3 in the morning and knowing that each one made him a little safer, a little stronger, a little more in control of a life that had never been under his control before. The nail wore down. Harry sharpened it on the concrete step outside the back door. It wore down again. He sharpened it again. The nail was his wand, though he didn't know the word, and it was enough. In the library, he'd moved beyond the rune book. He was reading about geometry now, how shapes created structural integrity, how arches distributed weight, how patterns repeated in nature. Honeycombs and snowflakes and the spiral of a nautilus shell. He didn't know why these things felt connected to his rune work, but they did. The runes were a language, and geometry was its grammar, and when Harry combined them, when he arranged runes in geometric patterns instead of straight lines, the effects multiplied. He discovered this by accident. He'd been scratching runes along the hallway baseboard and had to go around a corner, and the natural angle of the corner created a relationship between two runes that hadn't existed when they were in a straight line. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The air in the hallway became clean. Not just fresh but actively purified, scrubbed of dust and pollen and the stale smell of Vernon cigars, the way a thunderstorm cleans the air. It lasted for hours. Harry stared at the corner and thought about triangles. By the end of the 5th week, the hallway rune network included a triangle, a pentagon, and an incomplete hexagon. Each geometric shape amplified and refined the runes within it. The triangle of Thuris as Algisa created a zone of protection so dense that Vernon, walking through the hallway, would unconsciously speed up, his lizard brain screaming that he was passing through something ancient and patient and very, very aware of him. The pentagon of 5 different Kenas variations turned the hallway into a sensory network that fed information to Harry in real time: temperature, movement, intent, emotional state. Harry could lie in his cupboard with his eyes closed and know that Petunia was anxious in the kitchen and Vernon was angry in the sitting room and Dudley was bored upstairs and Mr. Tibbles from next door was sleeping on the garden wall. It was the most extraordinary thing Harry had ever experienced, and he was only just beginning. The incomplete hexagon bothered him. 6 runes, 6 points, but he'd only placed 5 because the 6th point fell in the middle of the kitchen floor, and he couldn't very well scratch runes into linoleum without Petunia noticing. So he waited, and he thought, and one night at 2 in the morning, he had an idea. He didn't need to scratch the rune into the floor. He needed to scratch it into something on the floor. The next morning, while making breakfast, Harry casually moved the small rug that sat in front of the kitchen sink, the one Petunia had bought from a catalogue, beige with a floral border, completely unremarkable, and found that the floor beneath it was tile, and tile was close enough to stone. That night, he lifted the rug, scratched a tiny Burkano, growth, renewal, nurturing, into the grout between two tiles, and replaced the rug. The hexagon completed itself with a sound that wasn't a sound, a deep, satisfied click that Harry felt in his molars. The effect was instantaneous and everywhere. The whole house settled. Like a building that had been clenching relaxed. The heating evened out. The lights stopped flickering. The persistent damp spot in the upstairs bathroom dried up. A hairline crack in the kitchen window that had been there since before Harry arrived sealed itself. And Harry's reach extended to every room. He lay in his cupboard that night, eyes closed, and felt the house. Every wall, every floor, every door and window and pipe and wire. Felt the Dursleys sleeping upstairs, Vernon snoring, Petunia's restless turning, Dudley's heavy stillness. Felt the wards he'd built humming in harmony, a chord struck on an instrument made of brick and plaster and a 7-year-old's desperate need to be safe. The cupboard glowed. Gold, warm, steady. Harry opened the rune book to the last chapter, the one about rune stones and rune staves, about the old masters who had carved runes into the lintels of great halls and the prows of longships and the blades of swords. He read the final paragraph. To the ancient Norse, the runes were not merely an alphabet. They were the fundamental forces of creation itself, fire and ice, life and death, order and chaos, given visible form. To carve a rune was, in some sense, to participate in the act of creation. It is perhaps fortunate that this belief was only that, a belief, and that the runes, for all their beauty and cultural significance, were never truly more than marks on stone. Harry looked at the glowing walls of his cupboard. He looked at the nail in his hand, worn down to half its original length, the tip still sharp, still ready. "You were wrong about that," he said to the book. He closed it, turned off his light with a thought, and went to sleep. Outside, the house at number 4, Privet Drive sat in its row of identical houses, on its identical street, in its identical suburb. It looked the same as all the others. Brick. White trim. Neat garden. Sensible car. But it wasn't the same. Not anymore. And it was never going to be the same again. Because inside, a boy with green eyes and a 3-inch nail was rewriting the rules, one rune at a time. And he was just getting started. Chapter 2, The Boy Who Watched 3 Years is a Long Time When You're Young. 3 years is long enough to read every book in the Little Whinging Public Library's Ancient History section twice. Long enough to work through geometry, trigonometry, and the first 50 pages of a university calculus textbook before the numbers stopped making intuitive sense and started requiring a kind of formal training that Harry couldn't teach himself from a book alone. Long enough to grow 4 inches, though he was still small for his age. The Dursleys' feeding schedule had seen to that, and even runes couldn't conjure food from nothing. 3 years was long enough to turn number 4, Privet Drive into something that would have made a team of professional ward builders weep with envy, if any of them had known it existed, and if any of them had been capable of understanding what they were looking at. Harry was 10. He woke at 6, the way he always did, not because of an alarm or Vernon's footsteps but because the house told him it was time. A gentle pulse through the rune network, warmth in the walls, a slight brightening of the light above his head, the faintest vibration in the floor beneath his mattress. His own personal sunrise, calibrated to his sleep cycle, delivered through 347 individual runes carved into every load-bearing surface of the building. He lay still for a moment and listened. Not with his ears. With the network. Vernon was awake, in the bathroom, running the tap. His emotional signature was its usual morning blend, irritable, hungry, vaguely resentful of the universe for requiring him to get out of bed. Petunia was in the kitchen already. She always beat Vernon downstairs, and her signature was tighter than usual, anxious, preoccupied. Dudley was still asleep. Dudley's signature was always the same, a flat, heavy nothing, like a stone at the bottom of a pond. Nothing unusual. No visitors approaching the house. No anomalies in the ward perimeter that extended, as of 6 months ago, to the property line and 3 feet beyond it in every direction. Harry got up, dressed in the least terrible of Dudley's hand-me-downs, jeans belted tight enough to stay on his hips, a jumper only 2 sizes too large, and opened his cupboard door. The hallway was dim. Dawn light came through the frosted glass panel beside the front door, gray and thin, standard English morning light that promised nothing and delivered less. Harry padded barefoot to the kitchen, where Petunia was standing at the counter with a cup of tea in one hand and a letter in the other. She startled when he came in. Tea slopped over the rim of the cup and she set it down too hard and the letter vanished behind her back with a motion so quick and guilty that Harry almost laughed. "Morning, Aunt Petunia. Don't sneak up on me like that." "I wasn't sneaking. I was walking." She glared at him. He didn't react. This was their dynamic now, and had been for years, a cold, careful coexistence built on the understanding that Harry could do things Petunia couldn't explain or prevent, and that Harry had no interest in doing any of those things to her as long as she left him alone. It was, Harry reflected, not a loving relationship. But it was functional. "I'll make breakfast," he said, moving to the stove. He still cooked. Not because they made him, the days of forced labor had ended around the same time Vernon's hand had blistered, but because he liked it. Cooking was precise. Cooking was cause and effect. Cooking was, in its own way, a lot like rune work. You combined elements according to certain principles, and if you did it right, you got a predictable result, and if you did it wrong, you learned something. Also, if he didn't cook, they'd eat nothing but Petunia's overboiled vegetables and Vernon's idea of a fry-up, which involved enough grease to lubricate a car engine. He cracked eggs into a pan. Put bread in the toaster. Started the kettle for Vernon's tea. Normal morning. Normal routine. Except that behind his back, he could feel Petunia reading that letter again, the one she'd hidden when he walked in, and her emotional signature was doing something he'd never felt before. It was afraid. Not of him. Harry knew what fear of him felt like in the network. He felt it from Vernon every single day, a low, constant hum of animal wariness that Vernon would die before admitting to. This was different. This was older. This was fear of something else, something the letter had brought back to the surface after years of submersion. Harry scrambled eggs and said nothing and filed it away. School was a thing Harry endured. He'd stopped trying to do well in the second year, after Petunia had received a report card with straight A's and had turned the color of curdled milk and said, in a voice like a closing door, "You are not to do better than Dudley." Since Dudley's academic achievements hovered somewhere between, barely functional, and genuinely concerning, this meant Harry had to actively sabotage his own work, misspelling words he could spell, getting arithmetic wrong on purpose, writing essays that were deliberately mediocre. He hated it. But it wasn't worth the fight. Not this fight, anyway. Harry had learned to choose his battles, and school grades were a battle with no strategic value. The teachers thought he was dim. His classmates thought he was weird. Neither opinion mattered. What mattered was what Harry knew, and what Harry knew had nothing to do with what they were teaching. He sat in the back of Mr. Harrison's Year 5 classroom and pretended to struggle with long division while his mind worked on something else entirely, the problem of triangulated resonance in overlapping ward fields. The issue was geometric. Harry had discovered, through months of careful experimentation, that rune arrays worked best when arranged in regular polygons, triangles, squares, pentagons, hexagons. Each shape had different properties. Triangles were stable and defensive. Squares were rigid and containing. Pentagons were perceptive, almost alive. Hexagons were the strongest general-purpose structure, the magical equivalent of a honeycomb, distributing force evenly across all 6 vertices. But when 2 arrays overlapped, when a triangle's edge crossed a hexagon's edge, for instance, the interaction was unpredictable. Sometimes the effects combined beautifully. Sometimes they cancelled each other out. And sometimes, on two memorable occasions, they'd produced effects Harry hadn't intended at all, once making every spider within 20 feet of the cupboard suddenly flee the house, which he considered a bonus, and once making the wallpaper in the hallway slowly change color over the course of a week, which he'd had to undo before Petunia noticed, though the wallpaper had been nicer in blue. The resonance problem was, Harry suspected, a question of harmonics. Musical harmonics. He'd read about it in a physics book, how vibrating strings produced not just a fundamental frequency but a series of overtones, and how those overtones determined the quality of the sound, the difference between a violin and a trumpet playing the same note. Rune arrays vibrated too, not physically but magically, and their overtones interacted. If he could map the overtone series of each array type, he could predict the interactions. He could design overlapping fields that complemented rather than conflicted. He could build word structures of arbitrary complexity, layer upon layer, each one reinforcing the others. He needed better mathematics. He needed the calculus textbook to start making sense. He needed Harry Potter. He looked up. Mr. Harrison was staring at him with the particular expression teachers reserved for students they'd given up on. Would you like to join us, or are you quite comfortable daydreaming? Sorry, sir. Problem 12, Harry. What's 4068 divided by 12? Harry looked at the worksheet. The answer was 339. He wrote 342. Close enough to look like he'd tried. Wrong enough to maintain the fiction. 342, sir. Mr. Harrison sighed. Close. Anyone else? Harry went back to thinking about harmonics. The walk home from school took 12 minutes if you went the normal way, along Privet Drive and left on Wisteria Walk and right on Magnolia Crescent and left again onto Privet Drive's far end, a loop that deposited you at number 4's front gate. Harry didn't go the normal way. Harry went through the park, which cut the walk to 8 minutes and had the added benefit of a large oak tree that Harry liked to sit under when the weather was decent. Today the weather was decent, early September, warm enough for shirt sleeves, the light going golden the way it did in that narrow window between summer and autumn when England briefly remembered what sunshine was. Harry sat with his back against the oak and his rucksack beside him and a library book open on his knees. An Introduction to Differential Calculus. He'd checked it out that morning and already gotten through the first chapter, which was Review, and the second chapter, which was Limits, and he was halfway through the third chapter, which was Derivatives, and everything was clicking into place like rune stones in a word array. Derivatives were rates of change. How fast something was changing at a specific moment. And that was exactly what Harry needed, because ward fields weren't static, they fluctuated, responded to stimuli, grew and contracted based on input. They were dynamic systems, and calculus was the mathematics of dynamic systems. He was so absorbed that he almost didn't notice the cat. It was sitting on the park bench across the path from him, a tabby with spectacle-like markings around its eyes, and it was staring at him with an intensity that cats didn't usually direct at children sitting quietly under trees. Cats reserved that kind of attention for birds, mice, and the occasional particularly interesting sunbeam. Harry looked up from his book and met the cat's eyes. The cat stared. Harry stared back. There was nothing overtly unusual about the cat. It was a perfectly normal tabby. It wasn't glowing, or talking, or doing anything that a normal cat couldn't do. But Harry's rune sense, the passive awareness that he carried with him everywhere now, a low-level perception of the magical energy that permeated everything, was prickling. The cat had a signature. Not like Vernon's or Petunia's or Dudley's, those were emotional signatures, the feel of a person's inner state filtered through the ward network. This was different. This was a magical signature. A hum of energy, contained and controlled and distinctly other, that said this cat was either not a cat or not an ordinary cat. Harry closed his book slowly and sat very still. The cat watched him for another 30 seconds. Then it jumped off the bench and walked away, tail high, with the particular dignity of a cat that wanted you to know it was leaving by choice and not because you'd spooked it. Harry watched it go. When it reached the edge of the park, it paused and looked back at him once, a long, evaluating look, and then slipped through the hedge and disappeared. Harry sat under the oak tree for a while longer, thinking. Then he put his calculus book in his rucksack and walked home, and as he walked, he expanded his rune sense outward in a way he didn't usually bother with, pushing his awareness past the property line of number 4, past the neighbors' houses, out into the street and the surrounding blocks. The world was full of faint signatures. Most of them were human, the ordinary background hum of people going about their lives, too faint and diffused to read clearly without a ward network to amplify them. But here and there, scattered like sparks in darkness, Harry caught flickers of something else. Something brighter. Something that resonated with the same frequency as the energy inside him, the energy that made the runes work. He'd noticed these flickers before, over the years. Hadn't known what to make of them. They were rare in little whinging, 1 or 2 at most, faint and transient, passing through. The cat's signature had been the strongest he'd ever encountered this close to number 4. Someone was watching him. Or watching the house. Or both. Harry reached the front gate and paused with his hand on the latch. The house looked the same as always, brick, white trim, neat garden, sensible car. Completely normal. Completely unremarkable. Underneath, the ward network hummed a greeting. Welcome home. You're safe. You're here. Harry went inside. I don't want him in the house. Vernon's voice, from the sitting room. Harry was in the kitchen, ostensibly doing homework at the table, actually working through Chapter 3, The Potions Master and the wardwright. The letter said to buy supplies in Diagon Alley. It did not say how to get there. Harry sat on his mattress the morning after his birthday, the supply list spread on his knees, and considered the problem. He had money, or he assumed he did, because the letter mentioned a vault at Gringotts and McGonagall had mentioned Gringotts during her visit, and it seemed unlikely that an entire civilization would invite an orphan to attend school without some provision for paying for it. He had a list of things to buy. He had a general understanding, from McGonagall and Snape's visit, that Diagon Alley existed somewhere in London, hidden behind magical barriers that kept muggles out. What he did not have was a guide. He solved this by going to the front garden at precisely 8 in the morning and sitting on the step and waiting. If the magical world had been watching him for weeks, and it had, he could still feel the periodic scanning from the north and the occasional signatures at his ward perimeter, then the magical world knew he'd received his letter, and the magical world would send someone. He was right. At 8:17, a signature appeared at the edge of his detection range. Familiar. Dark and sharp and barely contained. Moving toward the house with purpose. Snape. He materialized at the end of Privet Drive, apparition, that distinctive crack of displaced air that Harry had learned to recognize, and walked the length of the street with the kind of stride that suggested the pavement should be grateful for the privilege of being walked on. He was wearing all black again, but different black. Not the long coat from before but something more structured, a high-collared jacket over a dark shirt, trousers, boots. It looked almost military. It also looked, on Privet Drive at 8 in the morning, extraordinarily out of place. Harry watched him approach. Snape's eyes found Harry on the step and something passed across his face, not surprise, because Snape didn't seem like a man who let himself be surprised if he could help it, but perhaps acknowledgement. Of course you're already waiting. Mr. Potter. Professor Snape. Dumbledore sent me to escort you to Diagon Alley. Dumbledore didn't come himself. Dumbledore is a busy man. Dumbledore has been busy for 10 years, apparently. Snape looked at him. The scowl was in place, the default setting, but beneath it Harry caught something that might have been dark amusement. If you're waiting for me to defend the headmaster's choices, you'll be waiting considerably longer than you waited for me. Fair enough. Harry stood up and brushed off his jeans. How are we getting there? Side-along apparition. You'll hold my arm. It will be unpleasant. More unpleasant than the night bus. I read about that in a pamphlet McGonagall left. Everything is more unpleasant than the night bus, and the night bus is the most unpleasant form of transport ever devised. This should give you some idea of the scale. Harry almost smiled. Snape's humor was dry enough to cure leather, but it was there, buried under the permafrost, if you knew where to dig. He stepped forward and took Snape's arm. Snape glanced down at him, at the firm grip, the steady posture, the total absence of hesitation, and something in his expression shifted fractionally. "Close your eyes if you prefer," Snape said. "Most people find it easier." "I'd rather see." "Of course you would." The world compressed. It was nothing like anything Harry had experienced. The ward network vanished, not gradually but instantly, like someone had cut a wire, and the sudden silence in his mind where the house had been was almost as disorienting as the physical sensation. His body was being squeezed through a tube, that was the closest analogy, compressed from all sides by a pressure that was somehow both crushing and stretching at the same time. His lungs couldn't expand. His eyes streamed. The world was darkness and motion and a roaring in his ears that wasn't sound but displaced reality. Then it was over. 3 seconds, maybe less. Harry stumbled but didn't fall. He blinked, wiped his eyes, and looked around. They were standing in a small, shabby courtyard behind what appeared to be a pub. Brick walls, bins, a few weeds growing between the paving stones. Entirely unremarkable except for the fact that 30 seconds ago Harry had been in Surrey and now he looked at the sky, the buildings, the angle of the sun, central London. "The leaky cauldron," Snape said, nodding toward the back door of the pub. "Traditional entrance to Diagon Alley. We won't be going through it." "Why not?" "Because the leaky cauldron is where every witch and wizard in Britain goes to drink and gossip, and you, Mr. Potter, are the most famous person in magical Britain, and if you walk through that pub you will not emerge for 3 hours and most of that time will be spent shaking hands with strangers who want to touch the boy who lived like a good luck charm." Harry considered this. "You're right. Let's not do that." Snape produced a wand, dark wood, slightly flexible, about 13 inches, and tapped a specific sequence of bricks in the courtyard wall. The bricks shivered, rearranged themselves, folded outward like a stone flower blooming, and revealed a wide archway onto the most extraordinary street Harry had ever seen. Diagon Alley. It hit him all at once, the noise, the color, the sheer magical density of the place. His rune sense, which had been running on empty since the apparition severed him from the ward network, suddenly had input again, too much input, a tidal wave of magical signatures and ambient energy that crashed over his perception like a wave over a swimmer who'd wandered too far from shore. Harry gasped. Actually gasped, the air knocked out of him, his hands clenching at his sides. For 3 horrible seconds the world was nothing but noise, magical noise, a roaring symphony of 1,000 different spells and enchantments and wards and charms all playing at once, all at full volume, all directly into his unshielded awareness. Then his defenses caught up. The runic lattice that protected his thoughts, the one that had risen automatically when Snape had tried to look into his mind, expanded outward, forming a filter between Harry's perception and the magical cacophony. The noise dropped from overwhelming to merely intense. The signatures separated, differentiated, became individual instruments in the symphony instead of a single unbearable chord. Harry breathed. In and out. In and out. The way he'd taught himself in the cupboard, a lifetime ago. "Potter?" Snape was looking at him. Not with concern, exactly, Snape didn't do concern, but with sharp attention. "What just happened?" "Sensory overload," Harry said. His voice was steady. His hands had unclenched. "I'm used to reading a single house. This is." He looked down the length of Diagon Alley, the shop fronts, the crowds, the owls and the cauldrons and the window displays of impossible things, and shook his head. "This is a city. You can sense the ambient magic. I can sense everything. Every ward on every shop. Every enchanted object in every window. Every person on the street. It's like going from a quiet room to a rock concert. Snape studied him for a moment. Can you filter it? Already am. It's manageable now. Just, give me a second. Harry stood in the archway and calibrated. He dialed down the sensitivity of his rune sense the way you'd lower the volume on a radio, reducing the input to a level he could process without drowning. The individual signatures faded to a background hum. The ward structures on the buildings became architectural details rather than screaming beacons. The people on the street became presences rather than portraits. Okay, he said. I'm good. Then let us begin. Gringotts first. They walked. And Harry, despite everything, despite the sensory assault and the strangeness and the fact that he was walking through a hidden magical shopping district in central London with a man who looked like an overdressed vampire, felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Wonder. Not the breathless, uncritical wonder of a child seeing a magic trick. Something sharper and more specific. The wonder of a craftsman entering a workshop full of tools he'd never seen before and realizing that every single one of them was relevant to his work. The wards on these shops, he could read them, even through his filters. They were different from his own work, built with different techniques and different tools, but the underlying principles were the same. Runes. Geometry. Intent. The same language, different dialects. That shop on the corner, Flourish and Blots, the bookshop, had a layered ward system that combined standard protective enchantments with some kind of inventory management spell. Harry could see where the layers joined, could see the seams, could see how a professional ward builder had stitched them together. It was good work. Clean, efficient. But it was also rigid, built to a template, standardized, like a prefabricated house. Functional but not elegant. The apothecary across the street had wards that were messier but more interesting, layers added over years, probably decades, each one adapting to the specific needs of a shop that sold volatile magical ingredients. Containment wards over the storage areas. Freshness charms on the display cases. A particularly clever alert system on the back door that Harry spent several seconds admiring. And Gringotts, Harry stopped walking. Gringotts Wizarding Bank was a white marble building that dominated the far end of the alley. It was also, from a ward perspective, the most extraordinary structure Harry had ever perceived. The wards weren't just strong, they were deep, layer upon layer upon layer, going down further than Harry's perception could reach, built not over decades but over centuries. They were alien, too, not human magic, not the kind of runic work Harry did. Something older, something other. Goblin made, he guessed, remembering what McGonagall had told him about the goblins who ran the bank. The surface wards alone were staggering: anti-theft, anti-apparition, anti-concealment, identity verification, structural reinforcement, environmental control, and a dozen other functions Harry couldn't immediately identify. Beneath those, deeper layers pulsed with energies that Harry's perception couldn't fully parse, dark, ancient, patient things that had been down there for a very long time and would be down there for a very long time more. That building, Harry said. Gringotts, Snape said. The ward work on that building is the most sophisticated thing I've ever seen. The goblins have been building those wards for over 500 years. They consider wardcraft a martial art. Their best wardsmiths train for decades and are treated with the same reverence human societies reserve for generals. I need to talk to them. Snape glanced down at him. The goblins do not generally enjoy conversation with wizards. I'm not generally a wizard. No, Snape said. You are not. They climbed the steps. The bronze doors opened onto a vast marble hall filled with high counters staffed by creatures Harry had never seen before, short, sharp-featured, with long fingers and clever eyes and an air of absolute professional competence that reminded Harry of no one so much as himself. Goblins. The nearest one looked up as they approached. Its eyes, dark, bright, ancient, swept over Snape and dismissed him, then found Harry and stopped. Mr. Potter, the goblin said. We've been expecting you. Have you? Your vault has been held in trust since your parents' death. You are now of age to access it, per the terms of their will. Key. Snape produced a small gold key from his pocket. Dumbledore entrusted this to Hagrid, who entrusted it to me. The goblin took the key with the delicate precision of a surgeon and examined it. Vault 687. This way. They followed the goblin, Griphook, he introduced himself, through a door at the back of the hall and into a narrow stone corridor that sloped downward at an angle that suggested the vaults were considerably below street level. A cart waited on a set of tracks, the kind of thing you'd see in a mine. They climbed in. The cart dropped like a stone. Harry's stomach lurched. The tracks spiraled downward through darkness, the cart rattling and swaying, wind roaring past. Stalactites loomed out of the shadows and vanished. Tunnels branched off in every direction. The air got colder, damper, heavier with the weight of stone and time and deep, deep magic. Harry's rune sense was going wild. The deeper they went, the stronger the wards became, not just stronger but different, using principles he didn't recognize, geometries he'd never imagined. The goblins weren't working with Elder Futhark or any human runic system. They had their own language, their own symbols, their own mathematical framework. And it was beautiful. Complex and intricate and powerful in ways that made Harry's hexagonal arrays look like finger paintings. He wanted to stop the cart and press his hands against the tunnel walls and learn. But the cart was moving fast and Griphook didn't seem like the type for impromptu educational detours, so Harry closed his eyes and absorbed what he could through pure perception, drinking in the goblin wordwork like a parched man drinking water. The cart stopped. Vault 687. Griphook opened the vault with the key and a touch of goblin magic and the door swung inward and Harry looked at what his parents had left him. Gold. Stacks of gold coins, galleons, Snape told him, along with smaller silver coins, sickles, and tiny bronze ones, nuts. Not a fortune, not by the standards of old wizarding families, but more money than Harry had ever seen. More money than he'd ever imagined having. He filled a pouch that Griphook provided and noticed, as he did, that the vault itself was warded. Not just by the bank's general systems but individually, with specific protections keyed to the Potter family. He could feel them, faint, old, tinged with signatures he didn't recognize but that resonated with something deep in his own magic. His parents had touched these wards. His father had probably set them. The thought was unexpected and hit harder than Harry was prepared for, and he stood in the vault for a moment with a handful of gold and a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold air. "We should continue," Snape said from the doorway. Not unkindly. Just giving Harry a reason to move. Harry nodded. They continued. Back on the surface, in the bustle of Diagon Alley, Harry consulted his supply list and organized the shopping trip in his head. Robes first, practical, required, not interesting. Then the apothecary for potion supplies, moderately interesting. Then Flourish and Blots for books, very interesting. Then Ollivanders for a wand, uncertain category. The wand, Harry said, as they walked toward Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions. How does it work? I mean, I don't use one. I've never needed one. Why do other wizards? Snape was silent for several paces, considering. A wand is a focus, he said. Most wizards cannot direct their magic precisely without one. The wand provides structure, channels raw magical energy into specific forms and effects. Think of it as the difference between pouring water from a bucket and directing it through a hose. I use runes for that. You use runes to create persistent effects, wards, enchantments, structures. A wand is for active, immediate spell work. Transfiguration, charms, defensive magic. The things you'll be expected to learn at Hogwarts. Can I do those things with runes instead? In theory, yes. In practice, runic casting is exponentially more difficult and slower than wand work. Even the most accomplished runic practitioners in history used wands for combat and immediate spell work. Runes are for building. Wands are for doing. Harry filed this away. So I need a wand. You need a wand. Madame Awakens was a brisk, efficient shop run by a brisk, efficient witch who measured Harry with enchanted tape measures that moved on their own and had robes fitted and folded and packaged in 20 minutes flat. Harry stood on the fitting stool and watched the tape measures work and noticed, because he always noticed, the subtle charms woven into the fabric of the robes themselves. Sizing charms, durability charms, a basic weather resistance enchantment. Not runic work. Something else. One cast magic, embedded in the cloth through some technique Harry hadn't encountered. A boy with pale blonde hair was being fitted on the next stool. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been born expecting deference, high cheekbones, pointed chin, gray eyes that assessed everything they looked at and found it wanting. Hogwarts, the boy asked. Yes. First year. Yes. Me too. My father's next door buying my books. My mother's up the street looking at wands. The boy spoke with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had a reason to doubt that the world was arranged for his benefit. I'm Malfoy. Draco Malfoy. Harry Potter. The tape measure fitting Draco's sleeve dropped 6 inches. Draco's gray eyes widened. The Harry Potter? Unless there's another one. Draco stared at him with an intensity that was almost comical, the naked, undisguised hunger of a child who has just encountered a celebrity and is desperately trying to figure out how to turn this encounter to his advantage. Harry could see the calculations happening in real time, gears turning behind those gray eyes. My father says you've been living with muggles, Draco said. Is that true? It is. That must have been dreadful. Muggles are, well. You know. I don't know, actually. Tell me what muggles are. Draco blinked. He'd expected agreement, not a question. They're not like us, are they? They can't do magic. They don't understand our world. Father says your father says a lot, apparently. The words weren't aggressive. Harry delivered them the same way he delivered everything, calmly, conversationally, with the steady gaze of someone who was interested in what you'd say next but not particularly worried about it. But there was something underneath, a weight, that made Draco's mouth close mid-sentence. My muggle relatives aren't good people, Harry said. But that's because they're not good people, not because they're muggles. I've known magical people who aren't good people either. Seems like the magic isn't the variable. Draco looked at him for a long moment. He seemed to be reassessing something, the mental model he'd built of Harry Potter, probably, which almost certainly didn't include, calm, direct, and uninterested in flattery. I suppose, Draco said cautiously. Nice to meet you, Draco. Harry hopped off the fitting stool, Madame Malkin was done with him, and collected his packages. See you at school. He left the shop. Snape was waiting outside, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed in a pose that probably intimidated most of the wizarding population but that Harry found, increasingly, almost comfortable. Making friends? Snape asked. Making observations. The Malfoy boy, he's from an important family. The Malfoys are one of the oldest and wealthiest pure-blood families in Britain. Lucius Malfoy, the boy's father, is politically influential and was a known associate of the Dark Lord during the First War. He claimed to have been acting under the Imperius Curse, a mind control spell. Many people don't believe him. I am not among those people. That was very carefully phrased. I am a very careful person. Harry looked at Snape. Snape looked at Harry. Something unspoken passed between them, not information but understanding. Snape had layers. Harry was beginning to map them. Potion supplies, Harry said. Then books. Then the wand. The apothecary smelled of 100 things at once, herbs and minerals and animal parts and things Harry couldn't identify, all of them sharp and vivid and competing for attention. Snape moved through the shop with the fluid confidence of a man in his element, selecting ingredients from shelves and bins with the precision of a surgeon choosing instruments. "A basic potions kit is on your supply list," Snape said. "This will suffice for first year." However, he selected a small vial of something viscous and dark from a high shelf, examined it, put it back, selected another. "If you're serious about the subject, and I suspect you are, you'll want supplementary ingredients. Potions is the most overlooked branch of magic. Most students think it's cooking. It is not cooking. It is chemistry, and intent, and art." "You like it," Harry said. "I am the youngest potions master in British history." "Yes. I like it." Harry watched Snape select ingredients and added them to his basket and asked questions that Snape answered with increasing length and decreasing gruffness. The interaction of magical and mundane chemistry. The role of stirring patterns in activating catalytic reactions. The relationship between the emotional state of the brewer and the efficacy of the product. That last one caught Harry's attention. Intent affects potions. Like it affects runes. Intent affects everything in magic. The Muggles have a concept, the observer effect in quantum physics. The act of observation alters the thing observed. Magic is similar but more pronounced. The magical practitioner is never a passive actor. Your state of mind, your will, your emotional landscape, all of these are inputs into the magical process. So a potion brewed by someone angry would be different from the same potion brewed by someone calm? Potentially, yes. Which is why emotional discipline is among the most important qualities a wizard can develop. Snape looked at Harry with an expression that was hard to parse. "You appear to have an unusual degree of it already." "I had good teachers," Harry said. "Who?" "The Dursleys. They taught me that losing control was the worst thing I could do. Every time I let my emotions slip, bad things happened, to them, to me, to the situation. So I learned not to slip." Snape was quiet for a moment. They were standing in the narrow aisle of the apothecary, surrounded by jars of pickled newts and bundles of dried herbs, and the moment had the quality of a locked room, small, private, the air thick with things unsaid. "Your mother was the same," Snape said. Very quietly. Controlled. Even as a child. Even when everything around her was chaos, she was, still. It was the first thing I noticed about her." Harry stood very still himself. Every time Snape mentioned his mother, it felt like a door opening onto a room Harry hadn't known existed. He wanted to run through it. He made himself walk. "You grew up together. We lived in the same neighborhood. I recognized her for what she was before anyone else did. Before the letter. Before Hogwarts. I told her she was a witch." A pause. "She didn't believe me at first. But she believed you eventually. She believed the evidence. She was like that. Show her proof and she'd accept anything, no matter how strange. Deny her proof and she'd accept nothing, no matter how plausible." Snape's voice had lost its edges. It was almost, not warm, Snape didn't do warm, but, human. Unguarded. "You're very like her. People keep saying I have her eyes." "You do. But that's not what I mean." They finished at the apothecary and moved on. Harry carried a basket of ingredients and a growing understanding that Severus Snape was a far more complicated person than he appeared, and that his mother's shadow lay across both of them in ways neither had fully explored. Flourish and Blots was the bookshop, and it broke Harry's brain. Not in a bad way. In the way that a starving person's brain breaks when they see a feast. Harry stood just inside the door, his rune sense humming with the ambient magic of 10,000 enchanted books, and felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with wards or defense or survival. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. The kind he almost never let himself feel because joy was a luxury and Harry had been living in an economy of necessities. The shop was 3 stories tall and packed floor to ceiling with books. Not just stacked but organized, by subject and level and discipline, and the subjects, Harry read the section signs and his pulse quickened, transfiguration. Charms. Potions. Herbology. Astronomy. History of magic. Defense against the dark arts. Divination. Arithmancy. Ancient runes. Harry walked to the ancient runes section like a compass needle swinging north. 3 shelves. Maybe 60 books. He scanned the titles, his fingers trailing along the spines, and his heart hammered. An Introduction to Runic Translation. Elder Futhark, a Modern Magical Primer. Intermediate Runic Theory. Advanced Ward Architecture. Spellcraft and Symbolism, the intersection of runic and wand-based magic. He pulled Advanced Ward Architecture from the shelf and opened it and read the first page and felt the top of his head come off. The book was written in the language he'd been building for himself over 3 years, the language of runes and geometry and magical intent, but at a level of sophistication that made his self-taught work look like, well, like the work of a child with a nail. Which it was. But it was also recognizable. Harry could follow the arguments. He could understand the diagrams. He could see where his own intuitive discoveries intersected with formal magical theory and where they diverged. The divergences were as interesting as the intersections. Harry's approach to wardcraft was, he was beginning to understand, fundamentally different from the standard wizarding approach. Standard wardcraft used wands. It layered spells, wand-cast enchantments, on top of runic foundations, creating hybrid systems that were versatile but complex. Harry's approach was pure runic, no wand, no spellwork, just symbols and geometry and intent. It was older, simpler, and in some ways more powerful, because it eliminated the intermediary of the wand and connected the practitioner directly to the runic substrate. The book mentioned this approach. Called it archaic runic wardcraft and described it as historically significant but practically obsolete, requiring a degree of innate magical sensitivity and control that is vanishingly rare in the modern magical population. Harry read that sentence 3 times and then smiled. He bought the book. He also bought Elder Futhark, a Modern Magical Primer, Spellcraft and Symbolism, a book called Geometric Principles in Magical Architecture that looked like it would solve at least 4 problems he'd been working on, and his actual school books. The pile was enormous. Snape raised an eyebrow. Light reading. Research. You're aware that Ancient Runes is a 3rd-year elective. I'm aware that the Hogwarts curriculum puts Ancient Runes in 3rd year. I'm not aware of any reason that should limit my personal study. Snape looked at the stack of books, at the Advanced Ward Architecture sitting on top, a text that most Newt students struggled with, and the eyebrow stayed raised but the scowl softened by a degree that was, for Snape, practically a standing ovation. Your mother, he said, was the same way about charms. Bought every book in the shop her first visit. Read them all before term started. Drove her classmates insane. Good genes, then. Evidently. They reached Ollivander's at 3:30. The shop was narrow and dusty and crammed with long, thin boxes stacked from floor to ceiling. The sign above the door said Ollivander's, makers of fine wands since 382 BC. The ward work on the building was old and strange, not goblin-made, not standard wizarding, something else entirely. Something that felt almost alive, the way Harry's own ward network felt alive, as if the building had developed a consciousness over 2 millennia of continuous enchantment. Harry pushed the door open and a bell tinkled and the air inside was thick with dust and magic and the faint scent of wood and something else, something metallic and organic and utterly unique that Harry realized, after a moment, was the smell of magical cores. Dragon heartstring. Phoenix feather. Unicorn hair. The raw materials of wands, stacked in their thousands, each one humming at its own frequency in a chorus that was, to Harry's rune sense, staggeringly complex. Mr. Potter. The voice came from the shadows at the back of the shop. An old man emerged, pale, silver-eyed, with a quality of attention so intense that it bordered on the unnerving. Ollivander. He moved like his shop, dust and magic and something alive underneath. I wondered when I'd be seeing you. It seems only yesterday your mother and father were in here buying their first wands. Ollivander's silver eyes found Harry's green ones and held them with a steadiness that reminded Harry of his own gaze in the mirror. Your mother favored willow. 10¼ inches. Swishy. A lovely wand for charms work. Your father, mahogany. 11 inches. Pliable. Excellent for transfiguration. He circled Harry slowly, studying him the way Snape studied the apothecary shelves, with total focus, seeing things that ordinary observation would miss. You're different, Ollivander said. So I'm told. No. I mean, you're different. He stopped circling and stood in front of Harry and his silver eyes went very wide. Your magical signature. It's not. Mr. Potter, are you aware that your magic has been structured? If you mean that I've spent 3 years carving runes into everything I can reach, then yes. I'm aware. Ollivander stared at him. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound, more surprise than humor. Runic structuring. At your age. Without a wand. He shook his head slowly. This is going to be interesting. He disappeared into the stacks and returned with an armload of boxes. The wand chooses the wizard, Mr. Potter. This is the foundational principle of wand lore. The wand reads the wizard's magical signature and responds, or doesn't. Most matches are found within the first dozen attempts. Given your particular configuration, I suspect we may need more. They needed more. Harry tried wand after wand. Holly and phoenix feather, a shower of sparks that died immediately. Yew and dragon heartstring, nothing. Ash and unicorn hair, the wand vibrated once and went cold. Elm, maple, cherry, hawthorn, walnut, vine, cedar, rowan, nothing, nothing, a brief warmth that faded, nothing, a loud crack and scorch mark on the ceiling, nothing, nothing, nothing. 30 wands. 40. 50. Ollivander was not discouraged. He was, if anything, increasingly energized, his silver eyes brighter with each failure, his movements through the stacks faster and more purposeful. The problem, he murmured, pulling down a box from a high shelf, is resonance. Your magic has been shaped by runic practice. It expects to work through symbols and structure, not through the fluid channel of a wand. We need a wand that can accommodate that structure without fighting it. He opened the box. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, lay a wand. 11 inches, pale wood, with a slight curve near the handle that gave it an organic quality, like a branch that had grown into this shape rather than been carved. Holly, Ollivander said. 11 inches. Phoenix feather core. The feather was given by a phoenix named Fox, who gave only one other feather. Try it. Harry picked up the wand. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Warmth flooded his hand, his arm, his chest, not the gentle warmth of his rune network but something fiercer, more focused, like a beam of sunlight concentrated through a lens. The wand hummed in his grip. Not a passive hum but an active one, a reaching out, a greeting, a recognition. And then something else happened. The runes on Harry's body, the tiny ones he'd carved into the nail and transferred to his skin through contact, the ones that ran like invisible circuitry along his forearms and fingers and palms, responded. They lit up. Not visibly, not to ordinary eyes, but to Harry's rune sense they blazed gold, and the wand's magic flowed into them and through them and back into the wand in a circuit that completed itself with a deep, harmonic click that Harry felt in every atom. Golden sparks erupted from the wand's tip. Not a shower, a fountain. Arcing upward in spirals and helixes, forming shapes that Harry recognized with a shock of delight as runic, kenas, and suz, soilo, torch, breath, sun, the runes of illumination and power and victory, written in fire on the dusty air of Ollivander's shop. The sparks faded. The shop was quiet. Ollivander's silver eyes were the widest Harry had ever seen them, and there was a look on the old wandmaker's face, not surprise, not delight, but something deeper and more solemn. Reverence, maybe. Or awe. Curious, Ollivander whispered. Very curious. What's curious? The phoenix whose feather resides in your wand gave one other feather. Just one. And the wand that feather lives in. Ollivander paused, and his gaze settled on Harry's scar. The wand that feather lives in gave you that scar. The shop went very cold. Snape, standing by the door, made a sound, not a word, just a sharp intake of breath, like someone had stepped on a nerve. Harry looked at the wand in his hand. His mother's killer's wand shared a core with his brother wands. Twin feathers from the same bird, each choosing a wizard who would define the other's existence. He should have felt disturbed. Frightened, maybe. Connected to a monster by an accident of magical physics. He didn't feel any of those things. What he felt was the wand in his hand, warm and alive in his, and the runic circuit that linked it to his own magic, and the absolute, unshakable certainty that a tool was a tool and the hand that held it determined what it built. Good, Harry said. That means I'll understand him. When the time comes. Ollivander looked at Harry for a long time. Then he nodded, slowly, and began wrapping the wand box. Snape was silent all the way to the counter. Silent as Harry paid. Silent as they left the shop and stepped back into the noise and light of Diagon Alley. His magical signature was churning, storm clouds and lightning in something underneath that was dark and complicated and old. You believe he'll return, Harry said. Not a question. I told you I did. And when he does, my wand is his wand's brother. That's significant. In ways that I am not qualified to fully explain, yes. Then I'll figure it out myself. Harry slipped the wand box into his bag. I'm good at that. Snape looked down at him. The scowl was absent. In its place was something Harry couldn't quite name, a complex expression that combined recognition, concern, grudging respect, and the faintest ghost of something that might, in a different man, have been affection. Yes, Snape said. You are. They apparat back to Privet Drive at 5 o'clock. The ward network welcomed Harry home with a warm pulse that felt, after the chaos of Diagon Alley, like sinking into a bath. He stood on the front step with his bags of supplies and his books and his wand and looked at the house that had been his prison and was now his fortress and thought about what came next. Professor, he said, as Snape turned to leave. Snape stopped. Thank you. For today. For the information about my mother. For treating me like a person instead of a symbol. Snape stood very still on the front path of number 4, Privet Drive, his black coat sharp against the green of the Dursleys' lawn, and something passed across his face like weather across a landscape, fast, complex, involving systems too deep to fully track from the surface. You are not what I expected, Snape said. What did you expect? Your father. And what did you find? The pause was long. The evening light was golden. A blackbird sang in the hedge. Your mother, Snape said. He turned and walked to the end of the path and disapparated with a crack, and Harry stood on the step and held the moment in his memory the way you hold something fragile, carefully, knowing you'll want to look at it again. Then he went inside, and upstairs to Dudley's second bedroom, which Petunia had quietly, without comment, cleared of broken toys and made up as a proper room for Harry the week after McGonagall and Snape's first visit, and unpacked his books and opened Advanced Ward Architecture to Chapter 1 and began to read. He read until midnight. He read until his eyes burned and his brain was full to bursting with new concepts and new possibilities and the sheer intoxicating scope of what he'd been doing in miniature for 3 years and what was possible at scale. Ward networks that spanned miles. Defensive arrays that could stop armies. Runic structures that persisted for centuries, self-repairing, self-adapting, alive in every way that mattered. He could do this. He could do all of this. He had the talent, the understanding, the drive. What he'd lacked was knowledge, and now knowledge was pouring in like water through a broken dam. Harry set the book down and picked up his wand. It hummed in his hand, warm and ready. He pointed it at the wall and traced a rune, Kenas, the torch, in the air. The wand left a trail of golden light that hung for a moment, shimmering, before sinking into the plaster and settling there, glowing softly. The same rune he'd scratched with a nail 3 years ago. But faster. Cleaner. Stronger. The wand didn't replace his runic practice, it amplified it. The nail was a chisel. The wand was a laser. Harry smiled in the dark. The next morning he began the systematic process of rewarding his bedroom. Not the crude, intuitive work of his younger self, though that work had been effective and he was proud of it, but proper wardcraft, informed by theory, structured by mathematics, executed with a precision that would have impressed the professionals Snape had mentioned. He spent August doing 2 things, reading and building. The books from Flourish and Blots fed the building, and the building fed the reading. Every new concept he learned went immediately into practice. Every practical discovery sent him back to the books for theoretical context. The bedroom became a workshop. The walls were covered in rune arrays, drawn in light with the wand, permanent and precise and orders of magnitude more powerful than the nail-scratched originals in the cupboard. The ward network that had been limited to number 4, Privet Drive now extended to the entire block, a sensory web so fine-grained that Harry could count the heartbeats of every living thing within 200 meters. He didn't sleep much. Didn't need to, a combination of Soilo, vitality, and Gera, harvest, cycle, renewal, carved into his bed frame meant his body recovered in 4 hours what would normally take 8. He ate better too, because Petunia, in a continuation of the strange, cautious thaw that had begun after her confession in the kitchen, had started making him proper meals. Not with warmth, not with love, but with something that was perhaps the Petunia Dursley equivalent, effort. Harry accepted the meals and the room and the effort without comment, because Petunia wasn't doing it for him, not really. She was doing it for Lily. For the sister she'd failed. For the ghost that watched her from behind her nephew's green eyes. That was enough. It was more than Harry had ever had from her, and he wasn't going to waste energy examining the motivation. He had work to do. September approached. The books were read. The wards were built. The wand was an extension of his hand and his hand was an extension of his will and his will was focused and ready and aimed at the future like an arrow on a drawn string. The night before September 1st, Harry sat on his bed, his real bed, in his real room, with his trunk packed and his owl, a beautiful snowy owl he'd named Hedwig, bought from Elop's Owl Emporium on a second trip to Diagon Alley, the one indulgence he'd allowed himself, dozing on her perch, and looked out the window at Privet Drive. Quiet street. Quiet night. Street lamps casting pools of orange light on the tarmac. The hum of the ward network, steady and familiar, the sound of home if home was a thing Harry had ever really had. Tomorrow, Hogwarts. Tomorrow, a castle full of magic and knowledge and possibility. A castle with wards that had been built over 1,000 years. A library that made Flourish and Blots look like a corner shop. Teachers who could show him things no book could teach. Students who were, for the first time in Harry's life, like him. Magical. Different. His kind. And underneath all of that, deeper and darker and more important, a world where a dark wizard had killed his parents and might still be alive. A world where Harry was famous for something he didn't remember and couldn't explain. A world that had expectations of him, the boy who lived, the symbol, the savior, that had nothing to do with who he actually was. Harry looked at his reflection in the window. A thin boy, dark-haired, green-eyed, with a scar on his forehead that meant more to other people than it did to him. A boy who'd spent 3 years in a cupboard, building a fortress out of nothing, teaching himself a language that the magical world had forgotten. He wasn't the boy who lived. Not really. That was a story other people told about him, a narrative imposed from outside, a role in a play he hadn't auditioned for. He was the boy who built. The boy who learned. The boy who took a nail and a wall and his own desperate need for safety and turned it into something that made grown wizards stare. That was who he was. And tomorrow, Hogwarts was going to find out. Harry touched the wand on his bedside table. It hummed. He touched the window frame, where a line of runes glowed faintly gold. They hummed too. 2 systems, 2 tools, 2 languages, wand and rune, fluid and structured, sword and shield, and Harry spoke them both. He lay down and closed his eyes and the ward network dimmed to a whisper and the house settled around him, and for the last time, Harry Potter slept in the house on Privet Drive. In the morning, everything changed. Chapter 4, of the Calculus textbook. The door between the kitchen and sitting room was closed, but Harry didn't need it open. The ward network carried sound as efficiently as it carried everything else. Vernon, be reasonable, Petunia, quieter, the voice she used when she was managing him. Reasonable. Reasonable. Have you seen what he's done to this house? The heating doesn't work properly. The lights do whatever they please. I tried to open the cupboard last week, just to check, mind you, just to make sure he wasn't burning candles or something in there, and the door wouldn't budge. Wouldn't budge, Petunia. That's not normal. That's not, I know what it is. Silence. Harry's pen stopped moving over his calculus worksheet. He'd never heard Petunia say that before. Not those words, not in that tone, flat, tired, stripped of pretense. What do you mean, you know what it is? Vernon's voice had dropped from bluster to something wary. I mean, I know what he is. What he can do. I've always known. My sister could do the same things. A pause. The sound of Petunia sitting down, heavily, as if something she'd been carrying for a long time had suddenly gotten heavier. Not the same things exactly. She couldn't do what he does with the house. She was different. But the same kind of different, if you understand me. Your sister. Vernon said it the way he always said it, like he was handling something distasteful. The one who was a witch. Yes. Another word that was banned in this house, spoken aloud for the first time in Harry's hearing. She went to a school for it. A special school. They came for her when she was 11. A letter, and then a woman from the school, and then she was gone. Every September, off she went, and every summer she came back knowing more, able to do more, further and further from. Petunia's voice cracked. Not dramatically. A hairline fracture, quickly sealed. Further from me, she finished. Vernon said nothing. Harry could feel him through the wards, confused, uncomfortable, out of his depth. Vernon's emotional repertoire was limited: anger, satisfaction, contempt, hunger. This conversation required tools he didn't have. The letter, Petunia said. This morning. It was from one of them. Harry's attention sharpened. From the school? Vernon said. No. From the man who left Harry on our doorstep. Dumbledore. She said the name like it tasted of something bitter. He writes every year. Checking in, he says. Making sure the boy is safe, he says. As if leaving a baby on a doorstep in November is keeping him safe. You never told me, he wrote. I throw them away. Usually. This one was different. Rustling, the letter again. He says someone's coming to check on the house. He says there have been readings. Magical readings. Anomalous, he says. Whatever that means. He wants to know what's going on. Harry sat very still at the kitchen table. His calculus book was forgotten. His rune sense was fully extended, catching every word, every shift in emotional tone, every detail. Anomalous readings. Someone out there, in whatever world his mother had belonged to, was detecting his ward work. The rune network, which Harry had assumed was invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there, was apparently broadcasting on some frequency that someone else could pick up. The cat. The tabby with the spectacle markings. That was the someone, or one of the someones, or an advanced scout for the someones. Harry wasn't frightened. Fear was an emotion he'd largely retired, along with the desperate hope that the Dursleys might someday treat him as family. What he felt was something cooler and more useful, alertness. The same heightened attention he felt when working on a tricky rune combination, when one wrong stroke could collapse an entire array. Someone was coming. Someone from the world where his mother had learned magic. Someone who could detect what Harry was doing and wanted to know more. Good, Harry thought. He wanted to know more too. He went back to his calculus and waited. The visitors came 3 days later. Harry felt them before he saw them. 2 signatures, bright and sharp, appearing at the edge of his ward perimeter at precisely 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. They'd come from nowhere. One moment the perimeter was clear, the next moment they were there, as if they'd materialized out of thin air. They stood on the pavement across the street from number 4 for approximately 90 seconds. Harry, sitting in his cupboard with his eyes closed, read their signatures with the focused attention of a doctor reading an X-ray. The first signature was controlled, contained, tightly wrapped, the magical equivalent of a person in a well-tailored suit. Powerful, but organized. Everything in its place. This was someone who had been trained, probably for a very long time, in the precise application of whatever energy they possessed. The second signature was, interesting. Also powerful, also trained, but underneath the training there was something wilder. Something that didn't fit neatly into its container. Barely contained lightning. They crossed the street. They walked up the front path. They reached the front door. And the wards engaged. Not aggressively. Harry hadn't designed them for aggression, not the outer perimeter, anyway. The outer layer was diagnostic, it read incoming signatures the way a thermostat reads temperature, automatically and continuously. The next layer was evaluative, intent, disposition, threat level. The third layer was responsive, based on the evaluation, it would welcome, warn, or repel. These 2 visitors registered as, magical, trained, curious, slightly concerned, not hostile. The wards let them approach the door. But they didn't let them approach comfortably. The warning layer activated at a low level, not enough to cause nausea or vertigo, just enough to make the visitors aware that they were walking through something. A polite announcement, you are being watched. The doorbell rang. Harry opened his eyes, got up, and opened his cupboard door. He could hear Petunia in the kitchen, frozen, her signature spiking with anxiety. Vernon was at work. Dudley was at a friend's house. I'll get it, Harry called. He walked to the front door and opened it. 2 people stood on the step. The first was a woman, tall, thin, gray-haired, wearing a long green coat that was slightly too formal for a Tuesday afternoon in the suburbs. She had sharp eyes behind square glasses and an expression that suggested she was not accustomed to being kept waiting. This was the controlled, well-tailored signature. The second was a man, also tall, but in a different way, lean and angular where the woman was straight-backed and precise. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a face that looked like it had been designed for scowling and was currently living up to its potential. He wore a long black coat that somehow managed to be even more out of place than the woman's green one. This was the barely contained lightning. They stared at Harry. Harry stared at them. Mr. Potter, the woman said. Her voice was Scottish and crisp and carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume. That's me. My name is Minerva McGonagall. I am the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. This is Professor Severus Snape, our potions master. May we come in? Harry didn't move. He looked at them, really looked, with the rune sense as well as his eyes, and took a moment to process what he was seeing. They were saturated with magical energy. It wasn't just in them, it was of them, woven into their bodies and clothes and the air around them like dye in cloth. The woman's magic was green and silver and moved like a river, steady, powerful, directional. The man's was dark and sharp and moved like a blade, precise, lethal, always in motion. These were not amateurs. These were not people who scratched symbols into plaster with nails. These were the real thing. You felt the wards, Harry said. Not a question. The woman, McGonagall, blinked. It was a very small blink, barely a flicker, but Harry caught it. Surprise, quickly controlled. The man, Snape, didn't blink. His dark eyes narrowed fractionally and his magical signature did something complex, a kind of reaching out that brushed against Harry's awareness like a hand testing water. Harry let it touch the outer ward layer and stop. The runes responded automatically, not blocking the probe but redirecting it, showing Snape the surface of the ward structure without revealing its depth. Like letting someone see the cover of a book without opening it. Snape's eyes widened. Just for a second. Then the scowl reasserted itself. May we come in? McGonagall repeated. Her tone was patient, but there was a current underneath it, urgency, or something close to it. That depends, Harry said. Why are you here? We're here because your name has been on the enrollment list at Hogwarts since the day you were born, and because the magical monitoring systems at the school have been registering increasingly unusual readings from this location for the past 3 years, and because Albus Dumbledore asked us to investigate. McGonagall paused and looked at Harry over her glasses. We're also here because I asked to come. I was present on the night you were left here, Mr. Potter. I had concerns then. I find I still have them. There was something in her voice when she said that, the night you were left here, that was rawer than she probably intended. Not pity. Something harder and more personal than pity. Guilt, maybe. Or anger. Harry looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open. Come in. But Professor Snape, stop probing the wards. It's rude. Snape's expression did something complicated. You can feel that. I can feel everything that happens within 40 feet of this house. Your probe is about as subtle as a brick through a window. No offense. Snape stared at him. Harry held his gaze without flinching. The silence stretched. None taken, Snape said, in a tone that suggested considerable offense had in fact been taken but was being filed away for later consideration. He withdrew the probe. Harry felt the ward layer settle back into its resting state like water smoothing after a stone's been dropped in it. They came inside. Harry led them to the sitting room because the kitchen was Petunia's territory and the cupboard was his and neither felt appropriate. The sitting room was Vernon's, but Vernon wasn't here, and Harry took a certain quiet satisfaction in offering his uncle's armchair to a witch and a wizard. Tea? He asked. That would be lovely, McGonagall said. No, Snape said. Harry went to make tea. When he came back, McGonagall was sitting in Vernon's armchair looking at the room with an expression of controlled distaste, and Snape was standing by the window, his dark eyes scanning the walls and floor and ceiling with an intensity that told Harry he was seeing more than wallpaper and plaster. There are runes, Snape said quietly. Yes, Harry said, handing McGonagall a cup. Everywhere. Yes. Snape turned from the window and looked at Harry. The scowl was still there, but it had been joined by something else, a sharp, predatory curiosity that changed the geometry of his face entirely. You did this. Yes. You're 10 years old. Yes. You have no wand, no formal training, no access to magical texts, no wand, Harry agreed. No training. But I've read a few things. Mostly Muggle books about Norse runes and mathematics. He paused. I'm assuming you have a word for non-magical people. I've been using normal, but that doesn't feel right. Muggle, McGonagall said. She was holding her teacup but not drinking from it. She was staring at Harry. The word is muggle. Muggle. Right. Muggle books, then. I taught myself from those and from, well, trial and error. The room was quiet. Snape was looking at the wall behind the sofa, where, if you knew what to look for, and Snape clearly did, a sequence of 12 runes formed a dodecagonal array that served as one of the primary nodes of the house's sensory network. Each rune was the size of a fingernail, hidden in the texture of the wallpaper, invisible to anyone without magical sight. "This is impossible," Snape said. "And yet," Harry said. Snape looked at him. Harry looked back. The barely contained lightning in Snape's signature was moving faster now, agitated, like a caged thing encountering something it didn't understand. "Severus," McGonagall said, a warning note in her voice. "Minerva, you don't understand what I'm looking at." Snape's voice was low and intense. "This isn't accidental magic. This isn't a child's uncontrolled outbursts manifesting as environmental effects. This is wardcraft. Structured, layered, geometrically organized wardcraft of a sophistication I have never seen outside of Gringotts and Hogwarts itself. And he did it with a nail." Snape pulled himself away from the wall and crossed the room in 3 long strides and stood in front of Harry, looming, his black coat pooling around him like shadow. He was very tall. Harry was very not tall. The height difference was dramatic. Harry didn't step back. Didn't flinch. Didn't look away. He tilted his head up and met Snape's eyes and waited. Something passed between them. Harry felt it, not through the wards, but directly, a brush of consciousness against consciousness, quick and probing. Snape was looking into him, or trying to. Some kind of magical perception, similar to the ward probe but more personal, more intimate, aimed not at the house but at Harry himself. Harry let it in. Not all the way, he had defenses, though he'd never had cause to name them, and they rose automatically, a lattice of runic intent that protected his thoughts the way the ward network protected the house. But he let Snape see the surface. Let him see the calm, the steadiness, the total absence of fear. Snape pulled back like he'd been burned. "Lily's eyes," he whispered. So quietly that Harry almost missed it. So quietly that McGonagall, across the room, couldn't have heard. But Harry heard. And the name hit him like a bell struck in a cathedral. "What did you say?" Snape's face closed like a slammed door. The scowl returned, deeper than before, fortified with something that looked a lot like pain. "Nothing. I said nothing. You said Lily. That was my mother's name." Snape flinched. It was tiny, a micro-expression, there and gone. But Harry saw it and the wards felt it, a spike of raw emotion in Snape's signature, sharp and jagged and shot through with something so old and deep that Harry's runic perception couldn't fully parse it. "Yes," Snape said, after a silence that felt like it lasted a year. "It was. You knew her." "I did." Harry looked at Snape. Snape looked at Harry. The room was very quiet. McGonagall was watching them both with an expression that suggested she was seeing something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do with. "I'd like to hear about her," Harry said. "Sometime. If you're willing." Snape said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, shortly, and turned back to the wall, and the moment passed. McGonagall cleared her throat. "Mr. Potter." "Harry. I think we should discuss why we're here. You're here because I'm apparently famous in a world I didn't know existed, and because my ward work is setting off alarms somewhere, and because a man named Dumbledore, who left me on a doorstep in November when I was a baby, wants to know what's going on." Harry sat down on the sofa and looked at her. "Close enough." McGonagall set her teacup down. "Alarmingly close. How much do you know about the magical world?" "Almost nothing. I know my mother was a witch. I know there's a school. I know the runes I work with are connected to some larger system of magic that I've only scratched the surface of, literally. That's it. Do you know why you're famous? No. And I'd like to. McGonagall told him. She told him about Voldemort, she used the name, though her lips thinned around it, and about the war, and about the prophecy that Harry didn't need to know the details of yet, and about the night his parents died. Not in a car crash. Not drunk. Standing between their son and the most powerful dark wizard in a century, and dying for it. She told him about the killing curse that should have ended him and didn't. About the scar on his forehead, which Harry had always been told was from the car crash, and which was actually the mark of the most famous survival in magical history. About the fall of Voldemort and the celebrations and the infant who had been carried from the ruins of Godric's Hollow and delivered to the doorstep of number 4, Privet Drive. Harry listened without interrupting. His face was still. His hands were still. The words were not still, they were agitated, responding to the emotional storm inside him, the runes flickering and pulsing in patterns that Snape was watching from the corner with visible fascination. When McGonagall finished, the room was very quiet. They were murdered, Harry said. Yes. They were murdered protecting me. Yes. McGonagall's voice was steady but her eyes were bright. They were extraordinarily brave. Both of them. Harry nodded. He processed this in silence for a minute, 2 minutes, 3. The words settled as he settled, the flickering subsiding into a steady, low-frequency hum. The man who killed them. You said he's gone. He was destroyed that night. Or so we believe. You don't sound sure. McGonagall hesitated. It was Snape who spoke. There are those who believe the Dark Lord is not permanently destroyed. That he is diminished but not dead. That he will, in time, return. His voice was flat, clinical, offering information without commentary. I am among those who believe this. Harry looked at Snape. Why? Because I knew him. Knew what he was capable of. Knew what measures he took to preserve himself. Snape met Harry's eyes. He was not the kind of man who left things to chance. Neither am I, Harry said quietly. Something shifted in Snape's expression. Not softening, Snape's face didn't soften, wasn't built for it, but a recalibration. A reassessment. The way you look at something you thought was one thing and realize it might be another. No, Snape said. I'm beginning to see that. They talked for 2 hours. Harry asked questions. Many questions. Precise questions. Not the questions McGonagall had expected, she later told Dumbledore, not, can I fly a broomstick, or, what position did my dad play in Quidditch? Harry's questions were structural. Architectural. How does magic work? What are its rules? What are its limits? What's the theoretical basis for wand casting versus wandless magic versus runic magic? How are wards constructed professionally? What are the differences between my approach and the standard method? Why did Dumbledore leave me here specifically? What was the magical justification, not the sentimental one? McGonagall answered what she could. Snape answered what McGonagall couldn't. Between them, they gave Harry a rough map of a world he'd been part of his entire life without knowing it. The magical world. Witches and wizards. The Ministry of Magic. Hogwarts. Diagon Alley. Gringotts. The international statute of secrecy that kept the magical world hidden from the Muggle one. Wands and broomsticks and potions and spells and 1,000 other things that would have sounded like fantasy if Harry hadn't already been living proof that magic was real. You'll receive your Hogwarts letter next year, McGonagall said, on your 11th birthday. You'll be invited to attend the school for 7 years of magical education. What subjects? Transfiguration, that's mine. Potions, that's Severus's. Charms, defense against the dark arts, herbology, history of magic, astronomy. In 3rd year, you can choose electives. Ancient runes is one of them. Ancient runes, Harry repeated. 3rd year. Not first. It's considered an advanced subject. Harry looked at the wall behind the sofa, where his dodecagonal sensory array was humming quietly. Right. Snape made a sound that might, in a more expressive person, have been a laugh. There's the matter of your living situation, McGonagall said, and her voice changed, harder now, edged with the thing Harry had heard earlier, the guilt or anger. Harry, when Dumbledore placed you here, he did so because your mother's sacrifice created a blood protection, a ward, if you will, tied to your aunt's blood. As long as you live with a blood relative, that protection persists. It's what's kept you safe from those who might wish you harm. I know about the blood ward, Harry said. McGonagall stopped. You, what? I found it. 2 years ago. It's tied to the foundations, goes deeper than anything I've built. Old magic. Sacrificial magic, blood-bound. It creates a barrier against hostile magical intent directed specifically at me. Harry paused. It's also failing. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. McGonagall and Snape exchanged a look. What do you mean, failing? Snape said. The blood ward runs on a specific fuel, the connection between me and my aunt. Love, or something like it. Family bond. Harry's voice was matter-of-fact. Aunt Petunia doesn't love me, Professor. She never has. She tolerates me out of obligation and fear. The ward has been degrading since I arrived. I'd estimate it's operating at about 30% capacity. Silence. I've been reinforcing it, Harry continued. Patching the gaps with my own work. But the fundamental structure is compromised. If it were a building, I'd say the foundation is cracked and someone's been propping up the walls with scaffolding. My scaffolding is good, it'll hold for now. But the original protection, the blood ward, is not long for this world. McGonagall's teacup was shaking in its saucer. She set it down carefully on the side table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Harry with an expression that mixed admiration and horror in roughly equal measure. You're telling me, she said, very slowly, that the blood wards Albus Dumbledore himself constructed to protect the boy who lived are failing because the Dursleys don't love you, and that you, a 10-year-old child, have been personally maintaining the defensive perimeter of this house for the past 3 years. That's what I'm telling you, yes. I'm going to kill Albus, McGonagall said. Snape made the not-laugh sound again. The question, Harry said, is what happens next. You're going to go back and tell Dumbledore what you found. He's going to have opinions about it. I'd like to know what those opinions are likely to be. Dumbledore will want to maintain the status quo, Snape said. His voice was carefully neutral. He will argue that the blood protection, however diminished, is still the safest option. He will propose monitoring and support rather than relocation. And you? What do you think? Snape was quiet for a long moment. He was still standing by the window, dark against the fading daylight, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. But his magical signature was turbulent, storm clouds over deep water. I think, Snape said, that you are the most remarkable thing I have seen in 20 years of practicing magic. I think that what you have done with this house, without training, without a wand, without any resource except a nail and a library card, is so far beyond the bounds of normal magical development that I lack the vocabulary to properly categorize it. I think that you are sitting in a house with people who don't deserve you, maintaining defenses that shouldn't be your responsibility, and doing it with a competence that most adult wizards could not match. He paused. I think Dumbledore made a mistake leaving you here. But I also think that the mistake has produced something extraordinary. And I think that whatever happens next, you should be the one deciding it. The room was quiet. The wards hummed. The late afternoon light came through the window and caught the dust motes in the air and turned them gold. Thank you, Harry said. Snape nodded. McGonagall stood up. She looked like a woman who had arrived expecting one thing and found something entirely different and was still in the process of recalibrating. We'll speak with Dumbledore. And we'll be back, Harry. You have my word on that. I believe you. She hesitated at the sitting room door. Turned back. Harry. The wards you've built, the ones around this house. How strong are they? Harry considered the question. What's the strongest ward system you know of? Hogwarts, McGonagall said without hesitation. Built over 1,000 years by 4 of the greatest witches and wizards in history, reinforced by every headmaster since. Then mine aren't as strong as Hogwarts, Harry said. Not yet. But I've had 3 years and a nail. Give me Hogwarts library and a proper set of tools and ask me again. McGonagall looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised Harry, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not a professional smile, but a real one, warm and fierce and slightly terrifying. I look forward to it, she said. They left. Harry watched them walk down the front path from the sitting room window. At the end of the path, McGonagall turned to Snape and said something Harry couldn't hear. Snape said something back. McGonagall shook her head. Then they both turned on the spot and vanished, popped out of existence like soap bubbles, leaving nothing but a faint crack of displaced air and 2 rapidly fading magical signatures. Apparition, Harry guessed. Some kind of teleportation. He'd have to ask about the mechanics. He stood at the window for a while, watching the empty street. The sun was setting behind the houses across the way, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. A perfectly ordinary English evening on a perfectly ordinary English street. Harry touched the window frame. Beneath the paint, invisible to anyone without the sight, a row of tiny runes pulsed with gold light. Kenas. Algies. Manas. Iwas. Burkano. Knowledge. Protection. Self. Partnership. Growth. His mother had been a witch. His father had been a wizard. They'd died fighting a Dark Lord. He was famous. There was a school. There was a whole world. And someone named Dumbledore had left him on a doorstep in November and never come back. Harry filed that last piece of information in the same mental archive where he kept everything else, every slight, every kindness, every useful fact, every betrayal. It wasn't anger he felt, exactly. It was clarity. The same clarity he felt when a new rune combination clicked into place and the intent crystallized and the magic moved. Dumbledore had made choices about Harry's life. Other people had made choices about Harry's life. That was over now. From this point forward, the choices were Harry's. He turned from the window and went to find Petunia. She was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, the letter from Dumbledore in front of her. She looked up when Harry came in and something in her face rearranged itself, the usual mask of disapproval shifting, just for a moment, into something more honest. "They're gone?" she asked. "They're gone. Did they tell you? About everything? About my parents? About magic? About Voldemort?" Harry sat down across from her. "About why I'm here." Petunia flinched at the name Voldemort, which was interesting because she shouldn't have known the name, which meant she knew more than she'd ever let on. "You knew all of it," Harry said. "From the beginning. I knew enough." Petunia's voice was thin. "I knew your mother was, what she was. I knew she married one of her kind. I knew they were in danger. I knew they were killed." She paused. "I knew what the letter said when they left you. The one that was pinned to your blanket. What did it say?" Petunia was quiet for a long time. Her hands were flat on the table, on either side of the letter, and Harry could see them trembling very slightly. Her emotional signature was a tangled mess, fear and guilt and something that might have been grief, old grief, calcified and buried but still there. It said that Lily was dead. That James was dead. That you were the only one left and that the protection your mother's sacrifice created would only work if you lived with family. With me. She looked at Harry and her eyes were bright and hard. "It said I had a duty. And that's why you took me in." "Duty? What else was there?" "I didn't want you. Vernon didn't want you. We had our own son, our own life, and then you appeared on our doorstep like a package we hadn't ordered, with a letter telling us we had to keep you or the magical protection would fail and some dark wizard's followers might come and kill us all." Her voice cracked again. Wider this time. The mask was slipping. "I hated her for it," Petunia whispered. "For dying and leaving you with me. For making me responsible. For dragging magic back into my life after I'd spent years trying to get away from it. I hated her, and I hated myself for hating her, because she was my sister and she was dead and I should have been sad and instead I was just angry." Harry sat across from his aunt and felt, through the wards, the terrible weight of what she was saying. Not terrible because it was cruel, it was, but he'd known that for years. Terrible because it was true. This was the most honest Petunia Dursley had ever been with him, and the honesty was worse than the lies because it confirmed what Harry had always suspected: he was not here because anyone wanted him. He was here because his mother's death had created a magical obligation and Petunia had fulfilled it with the bare minimum of grace. "Do you hate me?" Harry asked. Petunia stared at him. The question sat between them on the kitchen table like a live thing. "No," she said, and Harry felt the wards confirm it: truth, or close enough. "I don't hate you, Harry. I never hated you. I hated what you represented. The magic. The world that took my sister away from me. Every time you did something impossible, it was like losing her again." She looked down at her hands. "I wasn't fair to you. I know that. Vernon is what he is. But I should have been better. I should have been a mother," Harry said. Petunia closed her eyes. A tear tracked down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, efficiently, the way she wiped everything: no mess, no fuss, no trace. "I can't change what's happened," she said. "I can't be what I wasn't." "No," Harry agreed. "You can't." He stood up. Petunia looked up at him and for a moment they were just two people in a kitchen, a thin, dark-haired boy and a thin, sharp-faced woman, related by blood and separated by everything else. "But you could try being honest from now on," Harry said. "About my parents. About magic. About what you know. That would be something." He left the kitchen and went back to his cupboard. Closed the door. Sat on his mattress in the golden glow of his runes and thought about his mother. Lily. Her name was Lily. She'd been a witch. She'd been brave. She'd loved him enough to die for him, and that love was a ward, the oldest and most powerful ward in this house, older than Harry's work, older than Dumbledore's work, older than everything. Blood and sacrifice and love. The foundations of the strongest magic there was. Harry picked up his nail and began to work. Not on the walls, there was no more room on the walls. He worked on the nail itself, carving runes so tiny they were barely visible, turning the tool into a vessel, a focus, a thing of power in its own right. The nail glowed in his hand. The runes glowed on the walls. The house hummed around him, alive and aware and his. Outside, the tabby cat with the spectacle markings sat on the garden wall and watched the house as the last light faded and the street lamps came on, one by one, down the length of Privet Drive. The weeks that followed were strange. Harry felt watched. Not by the Dursleys, their watching was familiar, a known quantity. This was different. Magical signatures appearing at the edge of his ward perimeter and lingering. Never approaching the house, never engaging the wards directly, just observing. From a distance. There were at least 3 different signatures. The tabby cat was one, McGonagall, Harry assumed, checking on him, keeping her word. A second was fainter and more erratic, appearing at odd hours and never staying long, someone under some kind of concealment, good but not good enough to fool Harry's sensory network. The third was strange, not a person but a thing, a magical object or device, positioned somewhere to the north, scanning the house periodically with a touch so delicate that Harry almost missed it the first time. Dumbledore's monitoring. It had to be. The man had left Harry here and set up some kind of remote surveillance, and now that surveillance was picking up Harry's ward work and feeding data back to wherever Dumbledore was. Harry didn't interfere with any of it. He let them watch. Let them scan. Let them collect whatever data they wanted. It cost him nothing and gave him information in return. Every probe taught him something about how their magic worked, how their detection systems operated, what they could and couldn't see. They couldn't see much, as it turned out. The remote scanning device, whatever it was, could detect magical energy levels and general ward strength, but it couldn't read individual runes or understand the structure of Harry's arrays. It was like trying to read a book by weighing it. You could tell it was heavy, but you couldn't tell what it said. Harry found this reassuring. His work was his own. Its details were private. Good. He spent those weeks preparing. Not for Hogwarts, that was months away, and Harry was not the kind of person who got excited about things that hadn't happened yet. He prepared for what came next. Whatever that was. He improved the ward network. Tightened the defensive layers. Added new sensory capabilities, the ability to detect apparition, the teleportation trick, within 200 meters. The ability to distinguish between human and animal magical signatures. A crude but functional alarm system that would wake him instantly if anything crossed the ward boundary with hostile intent, even in the dead of night. He practiced his rune work on other materials. Wood, stone, metal, cloth. Each material responded differently. Wood was warm and willing, stone was strong but slow, metal was sharp and precise, cloth was flexible but weak. The nail, now covered in micro-runes, had become something more than a simple tool. It was a focus, a channel, an extension of Harry's will. When he held it, his connection to the ward network sharpened, and his ability to shape new runes intensified. He read everything he could find that connected, even tangentially, to what he was doing. The calculus textbook finally yielded to persistent effort, and with it came a new mathematical framework for understanding ward dynamics. He applied differential equations to the problem of overlapping fields and solved the resonance issue that had been plaguing him for months. The solution was elegant, a phase-shifting technique that offset the harmonic frequencies of adjacent arrays so they complemented rather than conflicted. He tested this by building a new array in the back garden, hidden in the fence posts. A hexagonal detection grid overlaid with a triangular defensive net, the two systems phase-shifted to operate in harmony. The result was clean, powerful, and, for the first time, seamless. No interference. No bleed. Just two systems working together as one. Harry stood in the back garden and felt the new array come online and grinned. Not a small grin. A real one. The kind of grin that says I just figured something out and it changes everything. He was ready. He didn't know what for, exactly, but he was ready. The Hogwarts letter arrived on his birthday. July 31st, delivered not by post but by owl, a large tawny bird that swooped through the kitchen window at breakfast and dropped a thick envelope on Harry's plate, right in the middle of his eggs. Vernon choked on his toast. Petunia went very still. Dudley screamed and fell off his chair, which was the most exercise he'd had in months. Harry wiped egg off the envelope and opened it. Heavy parchment. Green ink. An elaborate crest featuring a lion, a snake, a badger, and an eagle. Dear Mr. Potter, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He read the letter. He read the supply list. Wand. Cauldron. Robes. Books. He read the note at the bottom, term begins September 1st. The Hogwarts Express departs from King's Cross Station, platform 9 3/4, at 11 a.m. Platform 9 3/4. Of course. He looked up from the letter. Vernon was purple. Petunia was white. Dudley was still on the floor. "I'm going," Harry said. Vernon opened his mouth. "I'm going," Harry repeated, and something in the way he said it, the quiet certainty, the absolute absence of anything resembling a request for permission, made Vernon close his mouth again. The wards hummed. The house settled. A breeze came through the open kitchen window, warm and smelling of summer, and the owl hooted once and flew away. Harry folded the letter and put it in his pocket and finished his eggs. Everything was about to change. Everything had been building toward this. 3 years of runes and mathematics and patience and growth, 3 years of turning a cupboard into a fortress and a fortress into a network and a network into a world, and now the next chapter was beginning. Hogwarts. A school for witches and wizards. A castle full of magic. A library full of knowledge. A 1,000-year-old building saturated with wards and enchantments and accumulated power. Harry touched the nail in his pocket, his nail, his first tool, his 3-inch piece of rusted iron that had started everything, and felt it hum against his fingers, warm with runic energy, ready for whatever came next. He was ready too. Chapter 5, First Week, First Blood. Harry woke before dawn. Not because of an alarm, not because of habit, but because the castle nudged him. A gentle pulse through the stone wall beside his bed, warm and deliberate, the Hogwarts equivalent of a tap on the shoulder. Harry opened his eyes in the dark of the dormitory, listened to the breathing of 4 sleeping boys, and understood immediately what the castle was telling him. Something had happened during the night. Something in the ward structure had shifted. He lay still and extended his rune sense outward, carefully, the way he'd learned to do in the first moments of waking, not a blast of awareness but a slow unfurling, like a plant stretching toward light. The dormitory first. Ron, Neville, Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas. All asleep. All safe. Their signatures were soft and diffuse, the way human magic always was during sleep, guard down, defenses dissolved. The common room below. Empty. The fire had burned down to embers and the house elves, Harry had felt them during the night, small bright signatures moving through the castle with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural, had already cleaned. The tower. The staircase. The corridors beyond. Harry pushed further. Through stone and wood and enchantment, his awareness spreading like ink in water, touching the castle's own ward structure and riding it outward. Hogwarts helped. The ancient awareness that had greeted him the night before was awake and attentive, and it opened for him, letting his rune sense piggyback on its own sensory network, extending his range from dozens of meters to hundreds. The Great Hall. The kitchens below it. The dungeons, cold, damp, heavy with old magic. The greenhouses. The grounds. The lake, which had its own magical ecosystem that Harry didn't have time to explore but filed away for later. The Forbidden Forest, which was a wall of wild magic so dense and complex that even the castle's wards stopped at its border. And the 3rd floor. Harry's awareness reached the sealed corridor and stopped. Not because he chose to stop. Because something stopped him. The containment wards Dumbledore had placed were strong, not as strong as the castle's foundational wards, not even close, but specifically designed to prevent exactly what Harry was doing, remote magical surveillance. They were opaque. Reflective. His rune sense hit them and bounced back, showing him nothing but his own awareness reflected in a magical mirror. Clever. Professional. Dumbledore knew his craft. But Harry noticed something the wards weren't designed to hide, because no ward could hide it, the wards were stressed. The containment structure was intact, but it was working hard, burning magical energy at a rate that suggested whatever was inside was pushing against it. Constantly. Relentlessly. Testing. Not the creature, Harry could still sense the large, living thing, and it wasn't testing the wards. It was sleeping. Something else was testing them. Something subtler. Something that shared a frequency with the dark presence in Quirrell's turban. Harry pulled his awareness back to the dormitory and lay in the dark in thought. Voldemort, or whatever fragment of Voldemort was riding Quirrell, was probing the third-floor wards. Trying to get through. Trying to reach whatever Dumbledore had hidden there. Which meant the thing on the third floor was something Voldemort wanted. Something valuable enough to infiltrate a school for. Something worth the risk of detection. What is it? Harry didn't know. But he intended to find out. Not by going to the third floor, that was what Dumbledore expected, what the warning was designed to provoke in curious children, a test or a trap dressed up as a prohibition. Harry wasn't going to play that game. He was going to play his own. He got up. Dressed quietly, in the dark, with the practiced silence of a boy who'd spent years moving through a hostile house without making a sound. Pulled on his robes, pocketed his wand, slipped the nail, his nail, worn to 1.5 inches now but still sharp, still humming with 3 years of accumulated runic energy, into his other pocket. The dormitory door opened silently at his touch. The staircase was empty. The common room was empty. The portrait hole swung open without the fat lady even stirring, the castle's doing, Harry suspected, smoothing his path the way his ward network at Privet Drive had once smoothed his. The corridors of Hogwarts at 5 in the morning were a different world from the bustling, student-filled passages of the day. Stone floors, torchlight, silence so deep it had texture. Harry walked and the castle walked with him, its awareness a warm presence at the edge of his perception, guiding without directing, suggesting without insisting. He didn't go to the third floor. He went to the library. The Hogwarts library was closed. Officially. The doors were locked and warded, because Madame Pants, the librarian, guarded her domain with a ferocity that made dragon mothers look negligent. But the wards on the library door were standard Hogwarts security wards, part of the castle's own system, and the castle was feeling cooperative. The lock clicked. The door swung open. Harry slipped inside. The smell hit him first, old paper, leather binding, dust, ink, preservation charms, and the faint ozone tang of magical text. Thousands upon thousands of books, stretching into the shadows on shelves that went up 2 stories and extended back into alcoves and side rooms that seemed to multiply the deeper you went. It made flourish and blots look like a newsstand. Harry didn't waste time browsing. He knew what he needed, information about what Dumbledore might be hiding, and information about how Voldemort had survived his apparent destruction. The first would tell him what the game was. The second would tell him how to end it. He started with the card catalog, an enchanted filing system that responded to spoken queries. Nicholas Flamel, Harry whispered, because Dumbledore's chocolate frog card, the one Ron had given him on the train, mentioned Flamel as a collaborator, and if Dumbledore was hiding something, it might be connected to his known associates. The card catalog shuffled and produced a card. Flamel, Nicholas. Noted alchemist. Only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone. C. Alchemy, Advanced, Immortality, Methods of, Stone, Philosophers. Harry stared at the card. The Philosopher's Stone. A legendary alchemical creation that could turn lead into gold and produce the elixir of life, which made its drinker immortal. The most valuable magical object in existence. And Dumbledore had hidden it in a school. Behind a locked door. With a warning that amounted to, "Don't look behind the curtain." Harry's jaw tightened. He understood, now, with a clarity that felt like cold water. This wasn't security. This was a lure. Dumbledore knew Voldemort was after the stone. Dumbledore had moved the stone to Hogwarts, probably from Gringotts, which had been broken into recently according to the Daily Prophet article Ron had shown him, and set up defenses around it that were strong enough to slow Voldemort down but not strong enough to stop him permanently. Strong enough to force a confrontation. In a school. Full of children. Dumbledore was using the stone as bait and Hogwarts as a trap and every student in the building as an unknowing participant in a strategy that assumed a level of control that no chess player, however brilliant, could guarantee. Harry closed the card catalog and stood in the dark library and breathed. He was not angry. Anger was a luxury. He was something more useful, he was certain. Certain that the adults running this school had made a calculation that prioritized strategy over safety. Certain that the calculation was flawed. And certain that he was going to do something about it. Not by confronting Dumbledore. Not by running to McGonagall. Not by doing anything dramatic or visible or expected. Harry was going to do what he did best, build. Quietly, systematically, thoroughly. He was going to reinforce the castle's existing defenses around the third floor with his own ward work that Dumbledore's monitoring couldn't detect, because Harry's pure runic approach operated on a frequency that wand-based detection systems weren't calibrated for. He was going to create a secondary containment layer that would hold even if Dumbledore's failed. And he was going to watch Quirrell, every minute of every day, mapping the Dark Presence's movements and capabilities, building a profile of the enemy the way a general builds intelligence before a battle. He'd start tonight. The library first. He needed more information about the castle's ward architecture, about the specific enchantments on the third floor, about Voldemort's known capabilities and weaknesses. Then the practical work, in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the castle was quiet and the wards were his to shape. But first, he had a full day of classes. And he was not going to be late. Harry shelved his urgency the way a soldier shelves fear before a mission, not gone, not forgotten, just set aside in favor of the immediate task. He slipped out of the library, walked back to Gryffindor Tower, and was sitting in the common room reading geometric principles in magical architecture when Ron stumbled down the stairs at 7 o'clock, yawning and blinking and looking like a ginger-haired disaster. "Mornin'," Ron said. "You're up early. Couldn't sleep. Breakfast?" "Always." The first class of the day was Transfiguration. McGonagall's classroom was on the first floor, a large stone room with desks arranged in curved rows facing a raised platform where the professor's desk sat. The desk was empty when the students filed in. On it sat a tabby cat with spectacle-like markings around its eyes. Harry looked at the cat. The cat looked at Harry. Harry's rune sense identified the cat's magical signature immediately, the same one he'd felt in the park in Little Whinging, over a year ago. Controlled. Precise. Green and silver. He took his seat and said nothing. The other students settled in, chattering, pulling out textbooks and quills. Ron slid into the seat beside Harry. Hermione was already in the front row, parchment laid out, quill poised, practically vibrating with readiness. The cat on the desk waited until everyone was seated. Then it leaped from the desk, twisted in midair, and transformed, fur to robes, paws to hands, whiskers to lips, into Professor McGonagall, who landed on her feet with the precise grace of someone who had done this approximately 10,000 times. The class gasped. Neville fell off his chair. Transfiguration, McGonagall said, is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts. Anyone messing about in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. She surveyed the room. Her eyes found Harry and something passed between them, not warmth, exactly, but acknowledgement. She'd seen the cupboard. She'd seen the wards. She knew what he was. And she was going to teach him anyway, hold him to the same standards, because McGonagall was the kind of teacher who believed that standards were a form of respect. Harry respected that. The lesson began. Matchstick to needle. The fundamental exercise in Transfiguration, changing the form of one object into another through wand work and focused intent. McGonagall demonstrated the wand movement and the incantation and the class began to practice. Harry looked at his matchstick. He picked up his wand. He pointed it at the matchstick and performed the wand movement and said the incantation and pushed his intent through the wand the way he pushed intent through runes, not the fluid, instinctive flow that natural wand users described, but a structured, deliberate channel, runic intent translated into wand output. The matchstick changed. Not gradually, not partially, not the half-silvered almost needles that other students were producing. It changed completely, instantly, snapping from wood to steel with a precision that left a tiny crack in the air, the sound of one form being wholly replaced by another. The needle sat on his desk. Perfect. Pointed, silver, eye and all. The classroom was quiet. McGonagall walked over. She picked up the needle, examined it, held it up to the light. Her expression was carefully controlled, but her magical signature was doing interesting things, a shimmer of surprise overlaid with professional satisfaction overlaid with something that looked a lot like pride. Full marks, Mr. Potter. On your first attempt. She set the needle down. Can you tell me how you did it? I structured the intent before channeling it, Harry said. Treated the transformation like a runic equation, initial state, target state, transformation vector. Defined all three precisely and pushed them through the wand as a complete package instead of letting the wand interpret a general instruction. The classroom was very quiet. McGonagall stared at him. That, she said slowly, is an approach to transfiguration that I have never encountered in 35 years of teaching. Is it wrong? It is the opposite of wrong. It is so precisely right that I need to sit down and think about it for a while. She didn't sit down. She straightened her spine and looked at Harry with those sharp eyes. Mr. Potter, I believe you and I are going to have some very interesting conversations this year. In the meantime, since you've clearly mastered matchsticks, try this. She placed a button on his desk. Turn it into a beetle. A live one. Transfiguration of inorganic matter into living creatures was, according to Harry's textbook, a fourth-year skill. He looked at the button. He looked at McGonagall. She raised an eyebrow. Harry pointed his wand at the button. He structured the intent, initial state, button, brass, 4 holes, 8 mm in diameter. Target state, beetle, living, genus Coleoptera, approximately 8 mm in length. Transformation vector, the complex, multidimensional change from inorganic to organic, from dead to alive, from simple to staggeringly complex. The last part was the hard part. Life wasn't just form, it was function. A beetle wasn't just a beetle-shaped object. It was a system, nervous system, respiratory system, digestive system, exoskeleton, musculature, instinct. Each system was a sub-equation within the larger transformation, and each sub-equation needed to be defined and balanced and integrated. Harry held the complete equation in his mind, all of it, every variable, every interaction, every dependency, and pushed it through the wand. The button twitched. Darkened. Sprouted legs. Wings unfolded from beneath a suddenly chitinous shell. Antennae emerged, twitching. The beetle sat on Harry's desk for a moment, oriented itself, and then scuttled toward the edge with the urgent purposefulness of a creature that had places to be. McGonagall caught it before it fell off the desk. She held it in her cupped hands and looked at it with an expression that had left professional satisfaction behind and entered territory that Harry could only describe as stunned. It's alive, she said. It's genuinely alive. Autonomous nervous function. This isn't animation, this is true organic transfiguration. She looked at Harry. Mr. Potter, this is Newt-level work. You asked me to do it. I asked you to try. I expected you to fail instructively. I did not expect, she stopped. Collected herself. Set the beetle on the desk, where it immediately made another break for the edge. 5 points to Gryffindor. And please see me after class. Harry saw her after class. The conversation was brief and significant. McGonagall told him that his approach to transfiguration, treating it as a structured equation rather than an intuitive art, was, to her knowledge, unique. She told him that she would be providing him with additional materials and exercises. She told him that she expected him to work through the standard first-year curriculum at his own pace, which she anticipated would be fast. And she told him, with a directness that Harry appreciated, that she had spoken with Dumbledore about his situation at the Dursleys and that she was not satisfied with Dumbledore's response. He believes the blood wards are still sufficient, McGonagall said. I told him what you told me, that they're degrading. He said he would look into it. He has not, to my knowledge, looked into it. That doesn't surprise me. Nor me, I'm sorry to say. McGonagall's mouth was a thin line. Harry, I want you to know that you have an ally in this school. Whatever happens. Whatever complexities arise. My door is open to you. Thank you, Professor. Now go to Charms before Phileas thinks I've kidnapped you. Charms was taught by Professor Flitwick, a tiny man who stood on a stack of books to see over his desk and whose enthusiasm for his subject was so intense that it was almost physically visible, like a personal force field of academic joy. He taught the levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa, and Harry performed it on his first attempt, sending his feather floating gently to the ceiling while most of the class was still struggling with the pronunciation. Flitwick squeaked with delight and awarded Gryffindor 5 points. Hermione, who had also succeeded on her first attempt, looked at Harry with an expression that combined satisfaction. She'd done it too, with competitive fire. He'd done it slightly faster, with genuine curiosity. How had he done it faster? Structured intent, Harry murmured to her. Define the equation before you cast. Hermione's eyes widened. She pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and started taking notes. Not class notes, theoretical notes. Harry could see her handwriting, dense and precise, covering the page in a diagram that looked remarkably like the mathematical notation he used for ward design. She was going to figure it out. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but Hermione Granger was going to reverse engineer Harry's approach to magic and probably improve on it, because that was who she was, a mind that couldn't encounter a problem without solving it and couldn't encounter a solution without optimizing it. Good. Harry wanted allies, and allies who could think were worth more than allies who could fight. Herbology was next, in the greenhouses, taught by Professor Sprout, a cheerful woman who was elbow-deep in soil before the students had finished sitting down. The subject was interesting. Magical plants were, from a runic perspective, living ward systems, their magical properties the result of organic runic structures grown rather than carved. Harry spent the lesson examining a pot of devil's snare with his rune sense and discovering that the plant's tendrils contained a natural analogue of the Isa rune, stillness, binding, ice, which explained why the plant constricted when you struggled and released when you relaxed. He shared this observation with Hermione, who went very quiet and then said, "That changes everything about how I understand magical biology," and spent the rest of the lesson in a state of quiet intellectual crisis that Harry found extremely familiar and slightly endearing. Lunch was loud and chaotic and Harry ate a sandwich and plotted ward placements in his head. Ron told him about Quidditch tryouts and Harry listened with half his attention while the other half mapped the castle's sensory network, learning its patterns, its blind spots, its rhythms. The afternoon brought history of magic, which was taught by a ghost named Professor Binns who had apparently died mid-lecture and simply kept teaching, and which was so monumentally boring that even Hermione's note-taking slowed to a crawl. Harry used the time productively, pulling out his copy of Advanced Ward Architecture and reading under the desk while Binns droned about goblin rebellions. Then came the class Harry had been waiting for. Potions was in the dungeons. The classroom was cold and dark and smelled of chemicals and preserved things and the particular institutional grimness that came from decades of students spilling noxious substances on stone floors. Cauldrons sat on workbenches. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of things that floated and things that squirmed and things that stared back at you with dead eyes. Snape entered like a weather front, a door slamming open, black robes billowing, silence falling in his wake the way silence falls when a predator enters a clearing. He swept to the front of the room and turned and surveyed the students with an expression that suggested he had been hoping for better and was profoundly unsurprised by the disappointment. "There will be no foolish wand-waving or silly incantations in this class," Snape said. His voice was soft. Dangerously soft. The kind of soft that made you lean in to listen and then flinch when the words hit. As such, I don't expect many of you to appreciate the subtle science and exact art that is potion-making. However, for those select few who possess the predisposition, I can teach you how to bewitch the mind and ensnare the senses. I can tell you how to bottle fame, brew glory, and even put a stopper in death." He paused. His eyes swept the room and found Harry, and Harry saw the decision being made, Snape's face tightening, the scowl deepening, a performance being prepared. The performance of a man who couldn't afford to show favoritism toward the son of the woman he'd loved, in a room full of students who would notice and talk, in a school run by a headmaster who watched everything. Harry understood. He understood it instantly and completely, the way he understood rune grammar, intuitively and without needing it explained. Snape was going to be hard on him. Publicly. Vocally. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to, because Snape occupied a position in the political landscape of this school that required careful management, and being kind to Harry Potter in front of the children of Death Eaters was a luxury he couldn't afford. The understanding passed between them in a glance. A flicker of Harry's eyes, "I know," and a fractional tightening of Snape's jaw, "Good. Potter," Snape said, his voice carrying the careful weight of an actor who knows his role. "Our new celebrity." A few Slytherin students snickered. Draco Malfoy smirked. "Tell me, Potter. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" "Draught of living death," Harry said. "A sleeping potion so powerful it simulates death. The asphodel provides the soporific base and the wormwood creates the paralytic matrix that suppresses autonomous function." The snickering stopped. Snape's eyebrow rose. "And where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat. It's a calcified mass that neutralizes most poisons by absorbing the toxic compounds before they can bind to tissue. Effective against organic poisons, less so against magical ones. And the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? They're the same plant. Aconitum. Also called aconite. The root is used in several potions, most notably the wolfsbane potion, which alleviates the symptoms of lycanthropy without curing it." The classroom was silent. Hermione, who had been practically levitating out of her seat to answer, slowly lowered her hand. Snape stared at Harry. The performance was struggling against the reality, the scowl was in place but the eyes behind it were bright with something that the Slytherin students couldn't read but Harry could. He'd given Snape a gift. 3 perfect answers, delivered without arrogance, demonstrating a level of preparation that even the most hostile observer couldn't dismiss. Snape could be hard on Harry in public. But he couldn't claim the boy was unprepared. "Adequate," Snape said, turning away. 1 point to Gryffindor. The lesson continued. The potion was a simple one, a boil-cure draught, well within first-year capabilities. Harry paired with Ron and guided him through the steps with the calm precision of someone who had internalized the principles rather than memorized the recipe. Ron, who had the manual dexterity of a blindfolded bear, nevertheless produced a passable potion, largely because Harry quietly corrected his technique 3 times without making a production of it. Snape swept through the room, criticizing everything and everyone, his black robes brushing the floor like the hem of a thundercloud. He paused at Harry's workstation, examined the potion, said, "Not terrible," in a tone that damned with faint praise, and moved on. Neville, unfortunately, did not fare as well. His cauldron melted. The potion spilled across the floor, eating through the stone, and Neville, who'd been splashed, broke out in angry boils and had to be taken to the hospital wing by Seamus. Snape was furious. Genuinely furious, not performance furious, the distinction was clear to Harry, who could read the emotional signatures in the room like sheet music. Neville's error had been dangerous. The spilled potion could have blinded someone. Snape's anger was the anger of a professional whose safety protocols had been violated, not a bully enjoying a victim. But it looked like bullying. It sounded like bullying. And Neville, who was already terrified of Snape, who had the self-confidence of a wet paper bag, who needed encouragement the way a plant needs sun, Neville just crumbled. Curled in on himself. Went silent and read and didn't look up for the rest of the lesson. Harry watched this and filed it in the increasingly complex category labeled Snape, problems. The man was brilliant. The man had loved his mother. The man was playing a dangerous game that required him to be cruel in public. But the collateral damage of that game was real, Neville was real, Neville's fear was real, and no amount of strategic justification changed the fact that an adult had just torn apart a child in front of his peers. Harry resolved to do two things: help Neville with potions privately, and have a conversation with Snape about the difference between performance and practice. Later. When the timing was right. Defense against the dark arts, the last class of the day, was a different kind of ordeal. Quirrell's classroom smelled of garlic. The man himself stood at the front, turban wobbling, hands trembling, stammering through an introduction that was equal parts incoherent and tedious. He was, by all external measures, the most pathetic teacher Harry had ever seen, and Harry had attended Muggle primary school, so that was saying something. But Harry wasn't looking at the surface. He sat in the second row, between Ron and Hermione, and he kept his rune sense extended in a tight, focused beam, aimed at Quirrell like a spotlight. The outer layer, the stuttering, garlic-scented mess, was exactly what it appeared to be: a weak, frightened man performing weakness and fear. But underneath, in the dark place that Harry had brushed against at the feast, the other presence was awake. It was watching. Not the class. Not the students in general. It was watching Harry. Harry felt the dark attention like a physical touch, a cold finger tracing the back of his neck, a pressure behind his scar that wasn't quite pain but was definitely not comfortable. The presence knew he was there. It knew who he was. And it was interested. Harry looked at Quirrell and let his rune sense push deeper, past the outer disguise, past Quirrell's own weak magic, into the dark core where the parasite lived. The presence pushed back, not violently, not yet, but with a firm, unmistakable no. Stay out. Don't look. This is mine. Harry didn't withdraw. He held his ground, not pushing further, not retreating, just there. Present. Aware. A wall meeting a wall. And in the contact between them, in the thin space where Harry's awareness and the dark presence touched, Harry felt something he hadn't expected. Curiosity. Not his, its. The dark presence was curious about him. Not afraid, not hostile, just intrigued. The way a snake might be intrigued by a mongoose, a recognition of something that was neither predator nor prey but a genuine opposing force. Interesting, the presence seemed to say. Not in words. In intent. You have no idea, Harry thought back, and withdrew. His scar throbbed for a moment, then settled. Quirrell stuttered on about vampires. The class took notes. Harry sat very still and began, in the privacy of his own mind, to design a ward specifically calibrated to the frequency of the dark presence in Quirrell's turban. It would take time. The frequency was complex, not a single note but a chord, dark and dissonant, made up of multiple overlapping signatures that Harry would need to map individually before he could build a defensive structure that covered all of them. But he'd done harder things. He'd built a ward network from scratch with a nail and a library card. This was just another engineering problem. A dangerous one. But still. The first week settled into a rhythm. Classes during the day: transfiguration, charms, potions, herbology, history, defense, astronomy on Wednesday nights. Meals in the Great Hall. Evenings in the Gryffindor Common Room, where Harry did his homework in 20 minutes and spent the remaining hours reading advanced ward architecture and the library's collection of runic texts, which were limited but useful. He also built friendships. Not deliberately, not strategically, genuine connections, forged in the ordinary crucible of shared meals and shared dormitories and the particular bonding experience of being 11 years old in a castle full of magic. Ron was easy. Ron was always easy, uncomplicated, loyal, funny in a self-deprecating way that Harry recognized as the humor of a boy who'd grown up overshadowed by older brothers and had learned to deflect insecurity with jokes. Ron's value wasn't intellectual, he'd be the first to admit that, but emotional. He was warm. He was real. He said what he felt and felt what he said, and in a world of hidden agendas and layered deceptions, that kind of transparency was worth its weight in galleons. Hermione was harder and more rewarding. She was brilliant, driven, and so hungry for knowledge that she sometimes forgot that knowledge was a means, not an end. Harry recognized himself in her, the same desperate need to understand, the same refusal to accept, "That's just how it works," as an answer. But where Harry's drive came from survival, Hermione's came from somewhere else, a need to prove herself, to justify her place in a world that hadn't born her. She was Muggle-born. The first witch in her family. And she carried that distinction like a weight, pushing herself harder and harder to compensate for a deficit that existed only in the minds of bigots. Harry told her so. Not gently, he wasn't good at gentle, but directly, one evening in the common room, when Hermione was near tears over a transfiguration essay that was already 3 times the required length and still, in her estimation, not good enough. "You're chasing approval from people who don't deserve the authority to give it," Harry said. "The blood purity idiots aren't going to change their minds because your essays are longer. They're going to hate you regardless. So stop writing for them. Write for yourself." Hermione stared at him with wet eyes and a trembling lip, and for a moment Harry thought he'd miscalculated, pushed too hard, been too blunt. But then something shifted in her face, a straightening, a hardening, a transformation that had nothing to do with wands, and she wiped her eyes and said, "You're right," and picked up her quill and crossed out a third of the essay, and what remained was tighter, sharper, and better. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it. I'm going to mention it constantly. I was afraid of that." Neville was the surprise. The boy was terrified of everything: Snape, his own shadow, loud noises, the dark, and his magical ability was so unreliable that he'd become the class joke. But Harry, who could read magical signatures the way other people read faces, saw something in Neville that nobody else seemed to notice. The boy's magic wasn't weak. It was suppressed. Locked down, tamped flat, held in check by something, fear, trauma, some combination, that prevented it from flowing freely. Harry recognized the pattern. He'd seen it in himself, in the years before the nail. Magic bottled up, compressed, forced underground by an environment that punished its expression. The Dursleys had done it to Harry. Someone, or something, had done it to Neville. He started helping Neville with potions. Not officially, just sitting next to him in Snape's class, keeping a quiet eye on the procedure, murmuring corrections before mistakes became catastrophes. Neville's potions improved. His confidence didn't, not yet, but the improvement was there, incremental and real, and Snape noticed. Harry saw the notice, a flicker of attention in Snape's dark eyes as he swept past Neville's workstation and found, for once, nothing to criticize. Then came Friday. Friday morning dawned gray and windy, autumn shouldering its way into September, the castle's windows rattling in their frames. Harry had been up since 4, in the library. The castle let him in every morning now, a routine they'd established without discussion, researching the specific properties of containment wards and the magical theory behind soul anchors. Soul anchors. Horcruxes. The darkest magic in existence. Harry had found the reference buried in a book called Secrets of the Darkest Art, which was in the restricted section. The castle had let him in there too. Harry suspected it had opinions about the dark presence on the 3rd floor and was arming him accordingly. The book was vile. Not just in content, though the content was nightmarish, a matter-of-fact guide to splitting the soul through murder and binding the fragments to physical objects, but in feel. The book's magical signature was sick, corrupted, like food that had gone off. Harry read it with the emotional detachment of a surgeon examining a wound and learned what he needed to learn and put the book back and washed his hands and still felt dirty. But he understood now. Voldemort had made Horcruxes. That was how he'd survived the night he'd killed Harry's parents, a fragment of his soul, anchored to an object somewhere, keeping him tethered to life even when his body was destroyed. It was why Snape believed the Dark Lord wasn't permanently dead. It was why the thing in Quirrell's turban existed, not a ghost, not a spirit, but a soul fragment, a piece of Voldemort that had been floating through the world for 10 years, looking for a way back to power. The Philosopher's Stone. Immortality. A new body. That was what Voldemort wanted from the third floor. That was the game Dumbledore was playing, dangling the possibility of resurrection in front of a desperate soul fragment and waiting to see what it did. Harry sat in the library as dawn light crept through the tall windows and felt the weight of this knowledge settle onto his shoulders like a physical load. He was 11 years old. He was a first-year student. And he was sitting on information about the most dangerous dark wizard in history that most adults in the magical world didn't have. The responsible thing to do would be to tell someone. Dumbledore. McGonagall. Snape. But Dumbledore already knew. Had to know. The man was the most powerful wizard in Britain, and he'd placed the stone here deliberately, and he'd hired Quirrell knowing, or at least suspecting, what Quirrell was carrying. Telling Dumbledore would accomplish nothing except alerting Dumbledore that Harry knew, which would change the dynamic of Dumbledore's game in ways Harry couldn't predict. McGonagall. Harry trusted her. But McGonagall operated within Dumbledore's system. She'd push back, she'd argue, but ultimately she'd defer. She'd go to Dumbledore and Dumbledore would smile and twinkle and say, "I have the situation in hand, Minerva," and McGonagall would accept it because she trusted the old man, even when she shouldn't. Snape. Snape was the closest to an equal Harry had in this school, someone who understood layers, who operated in the space between what was said and what was meant, who could hold multiple truths simultaneously without flinching. But Snape had his own game. His own loyalties, his own debts, his own complicated relationship with Dumbledore that Harry didn't fully understand yet. Involving Snape meant involving all of Snape's complications. So Harry would handle it himself. Not alone, he wasn't stupid, and he wasn't arrogant enough to think an 11-year-old could outmaneuver Voldemort solo. But on his own terms. Using his own methods. Building what needed to be built, learning what needed to be learned, preparing for whatever came. He closed the Horcrux book and stood up and went to breakfast. Friday afternoon was a free period. Harry used it. He started in the third-floor corridor, not inside the sealed area, but in the corridor itself, the stretch of hallway that led to the locked door. The castle was quiet at this hour. Most students were in the grounds or the common rooms, enjoying the last warm days of September. Harry knelt beside the corridor wall and pulled out his nail. Not his wand, his nail. The original. The 3-inch piece of rusted iron that had started everything, worn down to 1.5 inches, covered in micro-runes that made it hum in his hand like a living thing. The nail was better for this work. Subtler. Its magical signature was so low that it would barely register on Dumbledore's monitoring, a whisper where the wand would be a shout. And the runes it carved were pure, old-style, pre-wand, the kind of ward work that modern detection systems weren't designed to see. Harry pressed the nail's point against the stone and began to carve. Not the blunt symbols of his cupboard days. Not even the precise, mathematical arrays of his later work at Privet Drive. This was something new, something that had been growing in his mind all week, fed by the castle's own ward architecture, by the books in the library, by the raw, deep understanding that came from living inside the most heavily enchanted structure in Britain and feeling its magic sing through his bones every moment of every day. He carved a rune he'd never carved before. Not Elder Futhark, something older, something that the castle itself had taught him in the wordless language of stone and spell. A symbol that combined protection and containment and awareness and intent in a single, unified glyph that would have taken 6 standard runes to express. He carved it into the base of the wall, where the stone met the floor. Tiny. Invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. And he connected it, with a hair-thin line of runic script, to the castle's own ward network, plugging his work into Hogwarts' 1,000-year-old system the way you'd plug a new appliance into an ancient but still functioning power grid. The castle accepted the connection. Not passively, actively. Harry felt the ancient awareness reach down and examine his rune, turn it over, test its intent, verify its purpose. And then, with a warmth that was unmistakably approval, integrate it. His rune was part of Hogwarts now. Drawing on the castle's power. Feeding the castle his perception. A symbiosis. A partnership. Harry moved 6 feet down the corridor and carved another rune. And another. And another. 6 runes in total, spaced along the corridor, each one a node in a detection network that would tell him, instantly, in real time, regardless of where he was in the castle, if anything approached the sealed door. But the detection network was just the first layer. The second layer was defensive. Between each detection node, Harry carved a linked pair of runes, one defensive, one offensive, that created a responsive ward field. If the detection layer triggered, the defensive layer would activate, a barrier of compressed magical force, calibrated to the specific frequency of the dark presence in Quirrell's turban, designed not to stop a human body but to peel the parasite away from its host. To separate Voldemort from Quirrell the way you'd separate a tick from skin. It was the most sophisticated ward work Harry had ever attempted. It required a precision of calibration that pushed him to the absolute edge of his ability. Each rune had to resonate at exactly the right frequency, too low and it would miss the target, too high and it would affect everyone, not just the dark presence. He spent an hour on each pair, testing and retesting, adjusting by microdegrees until the resonance was perfect. When he finished, 2 hours had passed and his hands were shaking from the effort and the nail was warm enough to burn. But the ward was in place. A secondary containment layer, hidden in the castle's own ward structure, invisible to Dumbledore's monitoring, powered by Hogwarts itself. Harry stood up and pressed his palm against the corridor wall and felt the castle's response, a deep, resonant hum of satisfaction, ancient and vast, like a great machine finding its optimal rhythm. Thank you, Harry thought. The castle hummed. And underneath the hum, if Harry listened very carefully, something that felt almost like a voice. Not words. An impression. A meaning without language. About time. Harry almost laughed. The castle, it seemed, had been waiting for someone to do this for a while. He pocketed the nail and walked back toward Gryffindor Tower. The corridors were still quiet. The autumn light was fading, turning the stone walls gold and amber. Harry walked through his school, through his castle, through the wards that sang around him like a choir, and felt, not safe, exactly. Safety was relative, and there was a fragment of the darkest wizard in history living in a teacher's head 50 feet from where children ate breakfast. But prepared. Prepared and building and not standing still. Never standing still. That night, Harry was in bed, drifting between waking and sleep, his rune sense extended in the loose, unfocused way it went when he wasn't consciously directing it, when his detection network on the 3rd floor triggered. He was instantly, completely awake. Something was approaching the sealed corridor. Not a student, the signature was wrong. Not a teacher, the movement pattern was wrong. This was furtive, deliberate, careful. And the magical signature was doubled. Quirrell. Harry threw back his covers and grabbed his wand and was halfway to the dormitory door before he stopped himself. Rushing to the 3rd floor was stupid. It was what Dumbledore expected a Gryffindor to do: charge in, confront the danger, be brave and foolish and controllable. Harry was brave. He was not foolish. He sat back down on his bed and closed his eyes and let his rune sense sink into the detection network and watched. Quirrell was moving slowly down the 3rd floor corridor. His outer signature, the weak, fluttering one, was terrified. His inner signature, the dark one, was focused, intent, probing. The dark presence was extending tendrils of magic toward the sealed door, testing Dumbledore's containment wards the way Harry had tested them that morning, looking for weaknesses. It found one. A thin spot in the containment layer, where 2 ward fields overlapped imperfectly, the same kind of resonance problem Harry had spent months solving in his own work. The dark presence pushed at the thin spot, applying force with a surgical precision that Harry reluctantly admired. The containment ward held. Barely. The thin spot flexed but didn't break. The dark presence pushed harder. Harry's secondary ward layer activated. Not the defensive runes, not yet. The detection layer fed data to Harry in real time, and Harry made a decision. He triggered just the first pair of offensive runes, the ones closest to Quirrell's position. Not at full power. At 10%. A warning shot. The effect was immediate. The paired runes pulsed, sending a focused wave of runic energy directly at the dark presence's frequency. Not enough to separate it from Quirrell. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to disrupt, to break the dark presence's concentration, to interrupt its probing, to deliver a clear and unmistakable message. I see you. I know what you are. And you are not getting through. Quirrell screamed. Harry heard it through the detection network, a thin, anguished sound, muffled by distance and stone walls, but unmistakable. The dark presence recoiled, pulling back into itself, coiling tight in its hiding place behind the turban. Quirrell staggered backward, clutching his head, his outer signature a mess of pain and confusion and the desperate, animal terror of a man who was in far over his head and knew it. The corridor was empty within seconds. Quirrell fled back the way he'd come, stumbling, whimpering, the dark presence inside him silent and seething. Harry sat on his bed and breathed. In and out. In and out. The detection network settled back to standby. The castle hummed around him, a lone note of approval. It had worked. His ward had worked. Not as a permanent solution, the dark presence would adapt, would learn from this encounter, would probe more carefully next time. But as a first engagement, a declaration of presence, a statement of intent, it had worked perfectly. Harry's scar was throbbing. Not painfully, more like an echo, a sympathetic vibration, the resonance between his scar and the dark presence that Ollivander had hinted at. They were connected, he and Voldemort. Brother Wands. Brother Scar. Some link that went deeper than magic, that was written into the fundamental structure of both of them. Harry didn't flinch from this. Didn't fear it. He examined it the way he examined everything, with curiosity, with rigor, with the calm certainty that understanding was always better than ignorance. I'm connected to you, Harry thought, in the direction of the dark presence that was now huddled in Quirrell's quarters on the other side of the castle. I can feel you. I can find you. And every ward I build is calibrated to your frequency, because you gave me the calibration when you gave me this scar. You made me your enemy when I was a year old. You killed my parents and tried to kill me and you failed. And now you're in my castle, and you're trying to steal from behind my wards, and you have no idea at all, what you're dealing with. The scar pulsed once, warm, and then went cold. Harry lay back down and looked at the dark canopy of his four-poster bed and listened to Ron snoring in the next bed and Neville murmuring in his sleep and Dean turning over and Seamus breathing steady and slow. For boys, sleeping safe, in a castle that was safer tonight than it had been yesterday, because Harry had made it so. He'd tell McGonagall in the morning. Not everything, not the Horcruxes, not the stone, not the full picture. But enough. Enough to give her what she needed without compromising his ability to act independently. Enough to keep her trust without surrendering his autonomy. And then he'd keep building. More wards. Better wards. He'd learn every inch of this castle's runic architecture and integrate his own work so deeply into it that separating them would be like unweaving a tapestry. He'd study every branch of magic Hogwarts could teach him and a dozen it couldn't, and he'd build defenses so comprehensive that Voldemort, whatever fragment of Voldemort, whatever shadow or shade or soul piece, would never, never, never touch anyone in this castle again. He was Harry Potter. He was a wardwright. He was 11 years old and he'd started with a nail and a cupboard and he'd built a fortress and he was not done building. He was just getting started. Outside the dormitory window, the waning moon hung over the forbidden forest and the black lake shimmered with reflected starlight, and the ancient castle of Hogwarts sat on its cliff like a crown on a king's head, its thousand-year-old wards humming in the dark, strengthened now by something new. Something young and fierce and utterly, absolutely unafraid. In the corridor on the third floor, 6 tiny runes glowed faintly in the stone, so faintly you'd miss them unless you were looking. They pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, the heartbeat of a ward network that was just beginning. A heartbeat that said, in a language older than words, mine. This castle is mine. These people are mine. And I will keep them safe. The castle heard. The castle agreed. And the castle, which had waited a very long time for someone who spoke its language, settled more deeply into its foundations and hummed a note so low and vast that it was felt, not heard, by every living thing within its walls. In Gryffindor Tower, Harry Potter closed his eyes and slept, and the wards he'd built sang him to rest, and the castle watched over him the way it had watched over 1,000 years of children, patiently, fiercely, without end. In the morning, there would be more to learn. More to build. More to face. But tonight, the castle was safe. Tonight, the wards held. Tonight was enough.